Chapter 1247. The activation of the stronghold was nothing to the brainless low-grade undead. But for the high-grade undead who still had some ideas, it was definitely something to secretly breathe a sigh of relief. No one wanted to be destroyed, even if they had already died once. The undead had no morale to speak of, but the high-grade undead were more intelligent. Seeing that the swarm was large, the necromancers began to be less stingy with their magic and began to release large-scale magic. Plague clouds and wide-area shadow magic covered the main roads of Naxxramas, and the insects easily fell to their deaths. Their bodies blocked the insects that came later, and it was all a mess. Kel Thuzad, who was in the control room at the core of the stronghold, was actually very conflicted. He wasn't sure if the command group summarized from the basic control commands was really the source command. After all, the prosperity of the Pantheon was already 25,000 years ago. With Sardra's burning crusade, he killed many titans and burned a large number of titan creations. The authentic titan language had been lost. Most of the titan creations obtained from the Burning Legion had been modified by demons. Similarly, the titan creations occasionally obtained in the world of Azeroth had been modified countless times over the years. Even the language had been modified. Kel Thuzad carefully compared the source command he found. For example, this sentence, good. Good. Study. Day. Day. Up. Kel Thuzad was sure that this was different from all the languages he knew. It was different from the common human language, and it was definitely not a variant of Elvish, Troll, Eridar, etc., because the words, sentences, and grammar were all different. It should be the language of some destroyed country or race, Kel Thuzad was sure. He had no choice. He had to get Naxxramas out of danger as soon as possible. There was a real god behind Angela, and it was an evil god with a bad temper. Before the Lich King woke up, if he and his Naxxramas were destroyed here, it would be a waste. It was unknown whether the Lich King would avenge him in the future. In front of them was the Insect Tide, and behind them was the allied forces of the Sleeping Dragon Alliance. Stuck in the middle, there was only destruction. So he could only gamble. The huge bone palm that was the size of a water basin pressed firmly on the purplish-blue control screen of the void power furnace that gave off a technological feel. Kel Thuzad shouted, "Up! Up! Up!" The entire stronghold shook violently. The fortress that had fallen for a long time had a mysterious energy radiance on its bumpy outer wall. Mysterious patterns spread out like water ripples, as if they were rippling and spreading. An ice-cold aura spread out, but everyone felt that this was a blood-boiling ancient beast awakening, baring its shining fangs at all existences that were spying on it. Yes. That's right. That was it. Kel Thuzad was extremely excited. Not only him, but the other leaders of the Calamity Troop were also excited. Lord Kurtaz, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, rode his undead warhorse and charged at the hundreds of giant insects in front of him. Meteor. The Death Knight, who was a dwarf in his previous life, suddenly raised his right hand and summoned a huge flaming meteor, which shot towards the hundreds of insects at the entrance of the tunnel. The hundreds of insects in front were instantly turned into charcoal, and the insects in the back didn't fare any better. In the face of the unstoppable force, they were directly blown away and fell out of the passage of Naxxramas. Ha ha ha. As expected of Lord Kel Thuzad. Finally, I don't have to look at those disgusting insects every day. Black Witch Farina let out a long sigh of relief, showing an expression of relief. After she took over the command, the Calamity Troop was once beaten like dogs, and the other leaders were quite critical of her. Since Kel Thuzad had regained control of the fortress, then she had successfully retreated. She thought about many things. Although she had suffered a great loss in command, at least she hadn't collapsed. Maybe I can be promoted to the chief of a certain area with this achievement? Seeing that they were getting further and further away from the ground, the insects below became smaller and smaller. Seeing that they were about to escape the sea of suffering, Farina couldn't help but look forward to it. At this moment, Naxxramas suddenly jumped violently, giving Kel Thuzad and all the undead creatures a shock. Then, without any warning, the entire flying fortress began to lose its ability to float and plummeted to the ground. No, no, no. What are you doing? I want you to rise. Up. 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 Thuzad screamed. He quickly scanned the control panel with his scarlet eyes of the soul, only to see that on the control panel, almost all the data was normal. The only problem was that the system seemed to judge that he wanted to go down, not up. What was going on? The more Thuzad shouted, up, the faster the fortress fell. With no other choice, he could only try to say, down. In the end, it fell even faster. Bam, accompanied by a loud sound that shook the heavens and the earth, Naxxramas once again smashed onto the temple of Ankh-Karaj. Because it had risen for a distance before falling, this time it didn't fall on the ground, but directly smashed the first level of the temple and the first underground level. The undead in Naxxramas naturally lost their arms and legs, and the cursing sect disciples who were still alive also suffered serious casualties. Without giving the Calamity Troop any time to react, the fortress actually flew up again, but this time it was about the same. It flew up to a height of 500 meters, then fell down again. Then, a minute later, it flew up again and fell down. This time, it was like a pile driver smashing back and forth, smashing the second underground level. On the Heaven Breaker, the big shots of the Alliance watched this scene with their mouths agape. When Naxxramas smashed in, it was like dog sh*t. Alright, if the first time was dog sh*t, then the second time was dog sh*t, and the third time was dog sh*t with a mace. That was terrible. Gavin Rad originally wanted to say something dirty, but he suddenly realized that the atmosphere was a bit inappropriate, so he could only ask, Boss, did you secretly control Naxxramas? Then are you going to smash this flying fortress like a walnut? Smash? How could a Titan's creation be so simple? Besides, both sides haven't even used their ultimate moves yet. But it's going to happen soon. Duque murmured. This was practically confirming what Duque had said. The next moment, the entire temple of Ankh-Karaj seemed to come alive. From every hole in the temple, a thick tentacle with eyes extended out. The blue eyeballs at the top of the tentacles looked like a dense patch of seaweed from afar. These eyes were so ominous and terrifying. Even if you had trypophobia or not, just looking at them would make you feel nauseous. Chapter 1248. These giant eye tentacles were the eyes of the ancient evil god Thun, and also its tentacles. If these tentacles with eyes were treated as onlookers who came to watch the show, it would be hilarious. 3 seconds later, hundreds of giant eye tentacles widened their eyes at the same time. Rays of natural light, similar to a chain of lightning, shot straight into every passageway and hole in the outer wall of Naxxramas. Almost without a sound, tens of thousands of insects, together with their enemies, turned into ashes in this huge lightning-like electric net, turning into nothingness. Feeling the sudden high-energy reaction from below the temple, Thuzad was scared out of his wits. With all his strength, he forcibly injected his magic into the control system, trying to use his own magic circuit to connect with the control circuit of the Titan's power furnace. Get up! Get up! This kind of violent cracking was something Thuzad had always avoided. After all, he didn't know what the consequences would be if he connected his magic circuit to a power furnace with such a huge energy requirement. Perhaps he would gain control of the system, or the power furnace would drain his magic in reverse. This was another big gamble. He didn't know if he had gambled correctly or lost. Anyway, the whole of Naxxramas rose slowly for the 4th time. However, this time Thun should be furious, and it was not going to let go of this fortress that had provoked its divine power again and again. What's more, the fortress itself had the Titan aura that it hated. If it couldn't enslave the Titan creation, then it would completely destroy it. In less than 3 seconds, a huge red beam of light with a diameter of at least 50 meters shot straight up from the ground, broke through the thick rock layer, and shot straight at Naxxramas, who had just flown up. Thuzad was so scared that his teeth almost broke. He no longer cared about holding back. This time, he crushed a peculiar rune stone that he took out from his interspatial bag. Originally, this treasure, which was personally given to him by Lich King Arthas before he fell asleep, should have been his last resort. Unfortunately, he could no longer hold back. An incomparably gorgeous white light suddenly poured out of the suspended fortress. Bystanders could see from afar that huge clusters of ice were surging out of every window, every passageway, and every hole on the outer wall of the fortress that had been blasted open. In less than 1/100th of a second, these ice clusters formed an incomparably dense forest of icicles, and within 1/10 of a second, the entire fortress was wrapped in ice like a ball. This was a big move that was completely beyond the imagination of mortals. Perhaps only such a move could withstand the terrifying blow from Cyclone. The special skill, like the frozen tomb, collided with Cyclone's dark flash in midair. At that moment, the entire sky of Silithus seemed to flicker with the brilliance of the laws and elements. The clouds in the sky were instantly blasted apart. Even so, on the dissipating clouds, everywhere that could be projected, there were still dense purplish-black flame patterns appearing. At the same time, more dark energy was attacking the huge ice ball that covered the entire flying fortress. Under the flickering light, the spectators in the distance could clearly see the faint silver network that was flashing under the layer of ice. Duque said solemnly, "Are those the lines of law?" Not every powerhouse could see so many lines. Everyone could only see that the violent explosion and the turbulence of energy had turned the entire sky into a mess. The aftermath of the explosion spread in all directions, with Naxxramas as the center. As if there was a moment of delay, a shock wave that swept through everything erupted. In just half a second, tens of thousands of on-Karaj flying insects were directly crushed into large and small pieces by the shock wave, falling from the sky like a heavy rain. The powerful elemental energy fluctuations caused all the surveillance magic mirrors to lose their images. This didn't matter. Even from 10,000 meters away, on the suspended heaven breaker, they could still clearly see the huge cloud of flames rising in the distance. Duque turned back and said to the powerhouses of the Alliance, "It's not so easy to take advantage of them. These days, which powerhouse doesn't have one or two trump cards? If we had rushed up just now..." Everyone knew the answer. At any moment, the heaven breaker, which represented the most advanced technology in the Alliance, would have been affected by Naxxramas's wide area of ice, or by Cyclone's dark flash, and swept into the turbulence of destruction. That would have been a classic case of being buried with them. Okay. Send the attack signal. If we don't go, Naxxramas will fall into Cyclone's hands. 3 red signal flares rose into the sky and exploded in the clear, cloudless sky. The red ball-shaped signal flares looked like 3 large fireworks. Sal raised the hammer of destruction high. Loktar! Loktar! 50,000 orcs raised the metal weapons in their hands, wearing heavy armor, and began to advance towards the Karaj temple from 10 kilometers away. Further ahead, there were thousands of dragons and half-dragons. They would be the vanguard of the Allied forces. On the left, there were dwarf steam tanks equipped with sand filters and dust grills. On the right, there were more than 10,000 human cavalry. 1 kilometer behind the orcs, there was a neat central square formed by a mix of humans, dwarf gunners, Dalajan mages, and elven archers. The task of all the mortal armies was to deal with Karaj's insect army. Thuzad's heart was bleeding. The ultimate move that his master had given him was something that would kill 10,000 enemies at the cost of 7,000 soldiers. Freezing all of Naxxramas would certainly be able to withstand such a powerful attack. But the price? In just an instant, all the fragile items in the fortress were destroyed by the expanding ice cubes in a single breath. Fragile skeletons and rotten zombies, all kinds of precious experimental equipment and information, and of course, the cursing disciples who were originally alive. As the leader of the cursed god, Thuzad definitely understood the importance of having living subordinates. It was because of these living people that he could rope in the fallen nobles and do things better in the human world. Now, other than the Black Witch Farina, there was no one else alive in the entire fortress. Clenching his teeth, Thuzad shouted, "Unseal." The ice seal could not last long. Otherwise, even the undead would have all kinds of trouble. However, Just as Naxxramas unsealed the ice seal and moved westward in an attempt to escape the Silithus area as soon as possible, the fortress once again shook violently. This time, it was no longer a problem with the fortress's floating system. Not good. The Alliance's flying ship has crashed right in. Chapter 1249. Be careful. Duque warned as he watched the Alliance's powerhouses split into two groups. This was the enemy's territory. Even if they had the upper hand in the early stages, they could never be too careful. Duque didn't specifically say anything to his women. He had already said what he wanted to say last night. He and Aurelia were lovers, as well as like-minded comrades. Petty words of love were not suitable for them. Before they left, they expressed their love with an affectionate gaze. Ever since Turayan's disappearance, the Alliance had become short on manpower. After racking his brains, Duque finally decided on the teams. The ones going to the structure area were Magni, Gavin Rad, Benedicta's, Aurelia, Sasha, Edwin Van Cleef, and Alicia. The ones going to the military area were Tyrion, Liadeline, Korea, Tyrande, Sylvanas, Vanessa, and Jaina. Including Duque, who had gone into the spider zone alone, there were exactly 15 of them. The rest were either defending the Alliance's territory or supporting William's side. Sigh. My 40-man hero team. Who knew when he would be able to gather an all-star hero team again? Shaking his head to get the terrible reality out of his mind, Duque turned and set off. On his retina, Duque's vision had completely changed. Unlike the other heroes who advanced slowly and cautiously, Duque was simply unrestrained. After such a long period of observation and attaching all kinds of magical gadgets to the unprepared insects, and even the undying, the three-dimensional map of Naxxramas had long been imprinted in Duque's mind. Although he had also given Jaina and Alicia a copy, the two female spellcasters clearly didn't have such a heaven-defying positioning ability as Duque. When mainstream spellcasters used flash, they would at least see that the foothold was empty before they dared to flash there. Duque wasn't the same. He directly scanned the area and confirmed that it was safe. He didn't care if there were obstacles on the road or if there were visual shielding. Moreover, Duque was very sneaky. He flashed to a blind spot that even the undead couldn't detect, or to the top of a tall building. Of course, he also avoided the spider webs that covered the entire area. Don't underestimate those cobwebs that seemed to be gathering dust in the corner. That was because every small spider here was a descendant of the boss of the spider area, the giant spider, Meisner. This humongous female spider the size of a small mountain was the ancestor of all spiders, as well as their ruler. Any foreign existence, as long as it was not from the spider area, would be discovered immediately. Except for Duque. If Farina the Black Witch was still here, she might have sensed the strong arcane waves caused by Duque's high-speed flash. Unfortunately, Farina had been transferred to the central control area. Meisner, who relied too much on his physical senses, did not notice Duque's arrival. This was because every time Duque paused, the tip of his foot would step on a rock that wasn't covered by cobwebs, or even a protruding candlestick or even a torch. To mortal guards, if a torch suddenly went out somewhere, it would definitely attract attention. But spiders were different. Candlesticks that were always lit were places that the spider webs couldn't touch. Small spiders wouldn't go there either. But the necessary candlesticks were necessary for the followers of the cursing sect. This was because most of them were living people, not undead creatures that used their souls to see the way. This was where the blind spot was. Meisner's lair was a huge cylindrical tower with a diameter of at least 100 meters. It was unknown where the pitch-black top led to, and the deep hole that was covered by dense and crisscrossing cobwebs seemed to lead to hell. Strange purple square boulders with golden decorative lace almost covered the entire cylindrical tower tightly. The only entrance was a huge gap that was 2 stories high, and about 3 trucks could pass through it side by side. That was for the giant spider, Meisner, to enter and exit, but usually, the entire gap would be covered by 3 layers of cobwebs. Logically speaking, no creature should be able to bypass Meisner's senses and enter his lair without making a sound. Duque was an exception. Following the route set by the system, Duque turned his body into a streak of arcane light, thin and long. Even the fluctuations of arcane elements didn't touch the cobwebs. In the next instant, Duque had already flown above Meisner's body. At this moment, this giant female spider was just like Duque's impression of it. Its sickle-shaped, furry, and long legs were enough to cast a shadow over any woman's heart. Each of its legs rested on the thickest strand of cobwebs. Even if someone thousands of meters away touched the tiniest strand of cobwebs, the vibrations would be reflected back to Meisner. Then, the intruder would easily be surrounded and killed by the spiders that surged out from the sky and the ground. But Duque beautifully avoided all of these senses. This was Duque's advantage. It was also Duque's killing move. Only by killing the final boss of the spider area as quickly as possible could he regroup with the other two teams. Duque drew his sword. The peculiar spiral-shaped sword was like a dark shadow, soundless and silent. It was only when the tip of the sword touched Meisner's skull that it suddenly shone with the most resplendent golden splendor. The golden splendor that blossomed in that instant was the most dazzling of colors, as if it had instantly replaced the dark space. The godly sword special effect, Demon Slayer, activated. If the first half of the sword was like the summoning of hell, strange and secretive, then the second half of the sword was a classic example of shaking the heavens and shaking the earth, like a spring thunder. The golden splendor came from the top of Meisner's skull, silently and forcefully attacking. It was an extremely powerful and shocking sword. Meisner didn't even have the time to tremble in fear. He was already defenseless, and had no choice but to take the attack head-on. Duque was also dirty. He was clearly a wizard, but his most powerful move was to use the godly sword in his hand to assassinate. From killing Sardras to killing Arcarans, it had to be said that after countless experiences, Duque's grasp of the timing of an assassination had reached the pinnacle. Coupled with the godly sword's special effect, this sword was simply unstoppable. It was unstoppable. Spiders didn't look like creatures with strong defenses, and their defensive capabilities were only relative. If it was the small steel cannon that had blasted the orcs to tears in the scorching canyon, even 3 days and 3 nights wouldn't be able to shatter its skull. But with Duque's sneak attack, there could only be one result: the grand final boss of the spider area, Meisner, who had undergone a special transformation and had fused with an unknown amount of evil energy, suddenly opened his terrifying mouth full of spikes. Spiders didn't have a voice, but even so, Duque could still feel that it seemed to be letting out a mournful cry. Very quickly, this soundless cry was cut off. Chapter 1250. Because below its head, a neat black circle had appeared. Although all the carapace and brain matter in the middle had been evaporated by the intense holy light, there was still a hazy, misty black gas at the edge and a foul-smelling slurry dripping into the circle. Suddenly, Duque found that something was wrong. Without even a tenth of a second of hesitation, Duque directly dodged, and the spiral sword pierced into the hard stone wall. The destructive power of the divine weapon was still quite guaranteed. It was obviously a wall of light that did not allow a person to stand on it, but Duque unexpectedly pierced a hole, allowing Duque to hang on it. Meisner's expression changed. The surrounding dark power was constantly replenishing Meisner's body. The source was the fortress itself. The dark power was injected, and a magnificent and strange red color appeared. Duque watched dumbfounded as Meisner's dark back turned scarlet, and the joints of each of its legs grew red barbs in the shape of peppers. What was more exaggerated was that its body had swelled up a size. For a moment, Duque thought that Meisner was going to come back to life. After all, this was the undead's fortress, Naxxramas. If it was originally a living being, Duque would not find it strange at all if it suddenly came back to life. But Meisner did not come back to life. Even though its feet were still twitching from time to time under the stimulation of the dark power, as if it would make all kinds of climbing movements in the next second, it did not come back to life. In the end, it was just a beast controlled and bound by the dark power, and not a real undead creature. Seeing the system prompt that the boss had been killed, Duque was still not at ease. Once again flashing up, Duque directly followed up with a sword strike, allowing the holy light and flames to flow through Meisner's blood vessels, or perhaps through the channels, throughout his body. Seeing the huge spider burning and shrinking into a ball because of its nervous reflex, Duque was completely relieved this time. Pushing down the boss without looting the corpse was definitely a sin. When Duque burned the spider's silk and opened a treasure chest that had been wrapped in it for an unknown number of times, Duque's heart was simply surprised, happy, and confused. To his surprise, Duque discovered a large number of high-quality spoils of war, twisted limb, digested silk robe, and radiant cloak. These 3 pieces of cloth armor were actually superior to the level of Mount Hyjal. Logically speaking, in history, this should have been the second time Naxxramas came out to cause trouble. Based on this deduction, it wouldn't be a level 60 in the game, but a level 80 Naxxramas. What puzzled Duque was that there seemed to be quite a lot of level 60 equipment. Then what the hell is this? The happy part was that Duque had discovered 8 fragments of the artifact, Atish, the legendary guardian staff, among the spoils of war. That was a chicken drumstick. Ever since Duque inherited Mediva's legacy, he had been thinking about this artifact staff. Duque's hands were trembling with excitement and ecstasy. However, Duque still suppressed his excitement. He thought of the scene where Naxxramas turned into a huge block of ice to block Thun's blow. If I'm not wrong, it should be the power of the Lich King that enhanced the monsters and the leader of the entire fortress. Then the other 2 squads are a little bit in danger. With this thought, Duque couldn't care about anything else. He put the spoils of war into his space bag, and then directly launched a continuous flash to leave. Just by injecting a shadow magic into the corpse of the big spider, at this time, Naxxramas was very lively. A large number of Zergs were killed by the ice seal just now. Even a large number of Doomsday Army soldiers were killed as well. However, the Skybreaker disregarded everything and stuck its head in. None of the undead knew that the huge golden eagle's bow was actually a ram. When the collision was about to occur, the eagle's beak stretched forward and easily pierced a large hole in the wall of the fortress that was already riddled with holes. When the collision stopped, the cannons on both sides of the Skybreaker were fully opened, plowing through almost everything that was a threat in sight. After putting down the hero team, the Skybreaker could still retreat on its own. Together with the Black Pearl and the other 2 flying battleships, it used ropes to drag Naxxramas and set up a cannonball formation. At a distance of 50 meters, which was almost 0 distance for a cannonball battle, they ruthlessly beat up Naxxramas. Not only that, but they also sent out the 101st Airborne Division, which was formed by a certain someone out of bad taste. This elite squad of dwarf gunners, human warriors, and paladins only had 300 people, but they were firmly rooted at the entrance of the fortress like nails, using the cannons as cover, leaving a path of retreat for the Alliance's strong squad. Farina. Continue to command the fortress. Let the leaders defend their own areas and annihilate the invaders at the same time. I must control the fortress again. Kel Thuzad was a little flustered and exasperated as he used magic to inform Farina. Unless he was willing to abandon the fortress, abandon the entire undead army, and run back to the Ice-Crown fortress with a few leaders while preparing to bear the thunderous wrath of the Lich King, he had to hold on until the end. Thump thump thump. Like an inflatable fat man's abomination, it carried rusty iron chains and grappling hooks stained with dark red blood as it took heavy steps towards the Alliance's airborne division. Ready, fire. Along with the shout of Justin Barrett, the captain of the Skybreaker and a high-ranking commander of the Alliance, the sharpest dwarf gunners accurately fired the cannonballs into the deep and spacious passageways. The roar of the 155mm cannons resounded through the sky. Even if this thing didn't hit, it could still scorch an area of dozens of meters. Did it hit? Haha. Did you see that nearly 4-meter-tall abomination made from rotten flesh? It was directly smashed into meat paste, and even the rotten flesh turned to ash in midair. Under the cover of such powerful artillery fire, even the Death Knights with undead warhorses found it difficult to forcefully attack the Alliance elites nailed at the passageway. In the dark main control room, hundreds of light screens flickered continuously. There were real-time battle scenes, as well as various data that symbolized the comparison of forces. No matter how you looked at it, the Calamity Army was in trouble. Farina was flustered. Let the 3rd Squadron of Death Knights fill in and attack the Alliance at the passageway. What about the Gargoyle troops? Do we still have ice dragons? Just as she and her low-level Lich subordinates were busy in the command center, no one noticed that the cobwebs that originally covered the outside of the main control room had quietly changed color. From its original bright and dazzling white color, it turned into a dark matte color. This was not their fault. No one would have thought that the dignified leader of the Spider District, Meisner, would be silently killed in one shot. Chapter 1251. However, as the core of Naxxrama's command center, it was not so easy to break in. In addition to the continuous spider webs covering the entire control room, there were also hundreds of elite Death Knights and abominations guarding it. More importantly, there was a magic shield with no blind spots. If it was a verification type of magic shield, there would be other ways. Unfortunately, ever since a certain someone had successfully infiltrated the Frost Dragon's lair and saved Tyrant and Sylvanas, who were favored by Kel Thuzad, it would be an insult to the intelligence of the leaders of the Scourge Army if they didn't have any new tricks up their sleeves. The Scourge Army's defensive strategy was to reject all outsiders at the start of the war. Duque, who was hiding in the dark, frowned. This is a bit tricky. Because he foresaw the upcoming series of battles, Duque wanted to preserve as much strength as possible for himself. However, after weighing the pros and cons, Duque still decided that he could not hold back. Let's do it. Duque's eyes sharpened, and his entire body flashed with a bright arcane light. He did not choose to use invisibility. Since he would definitely be discovered, there was no point in sneaking in. Who is it? The Death Knight who abided by his duty discovered Duque immediately. Enemy, the shrill soul cry of the leading Death Knight echoed in the minds of every undead around him. Not only the guards, but even the defensive magic arrays in the surroundings also reacted. Accompanied by a siren that sounded gentle to the living but extremely ear-piercing to the undead, the magic towers that were already in a combat-ready state shot dozens of violent shadow arrows at Duque. This was not ordinary shadow magic. The purity of the magic was enough to make an ordinary Breaking Dawn mage speechless, not to mention that the magic contained strange curses. If it was an ordinary Radiant Moon mage, even one arrow would be enough to kill him. This scene of shadow arrow rain whistling towards Duque, with an unstoppable momentum that could destroy everything in its path. Indeed, Duque could activate Ice Barrier to open a refrigerator and adjust the concentration of frost elements in his body to the highest, rejecting other magical elements as much as possible. But then, Duque made a decision that no one would have thought of. He maintained his high-speed sprint with long strides. Idiot. The Death Knight leader's face that had not completely rotted squeezed out a sarcastic expression. That was a bad plan. What a terrible plan. How could mortals resist such concentrated magic power with their flesh and blood? Even if it was Kel Thuzad himself, he wouldn't be able to take this wave of shadow arrow rain without using a powerful magic shield. Rumble. A loud explosion resounded, followed by the impact of the shadow energy. The marble floor tiles, which were so solid that even the Frost Wyrms couldn't crush them with their feet, and were reinforced with magical defensive arrays, instantly turned into honeycombs. The sculptures and decorations on both sides of the tunnel were easily destroyed by the aftermath of the shadow energy, turning into dust and scattering with the wind. Not to mention Duque, who was being attacked by the dark arrow hail. In that instant, it was as if Sardras, the Demon King in his perfect state, had personally unleashed his thunderous fury. Whistling sounds could be heard, and the shadow arrows that were shot from the magic towers in all directions could no longer be called arrows. The black lightning, which was as thick as a water tank, was simply a cannon with unparalleled power. Poof! When a large mass of dense black cannon flames landed on the ground where Duque was, the ground that was the size of half a football field disappeared without a sound. A bottomless hole was blasted in the ground. Only the aftermath of the shadow energy, which was similar to black smoke, instantly appeared on the ground, telling what had happened here in that instant. After all, no Undying had ever seen what the magical defensive system of the control center looked like when it was activated. Now they had all seen it. This was only the first volley of shadow bolts. What would happen if all the mana stored in the mana system were to be unleashed? Wouldn't that pierce through the entire bottom of the fortress? Or even sink the fortress and destroy the enemy and the entire lower level of the fortress? Such a scene made all the Undying present shudder, but they also had a kind of twisted ecstasy. Perhaps, even if it was a genuine demigod, he would be blown into ashes in an instant, and his soul would fly away and scatter. Of course, the main control room was alarmed. Looking at the silent annihilation of the ground and Duque who had disappeared without a trace, the Black Witch Farina found that her body was actually filled with a perverted ecstasy and excitement. Because the moment the alarm rang, she recognized that the person who came was the one who made Kel, Thuzad and the entire Scourge army lose their heads and faces. Even His Majesty the Lich King, Arthas, had fallen in his hands, Duke Marcus. Now, such a peerless mortal powerhouse had actually been killed by her, the Great Black Witch. Wasn't this a great merit? Ha ha ha. Dead, right? Dead, right? Do you think Naxxramas is your backyard? Do you think you can casually enter the great kingdom of the dead? Ha ha ha. How dare you defy His Majesty the Lich King? Destruction is your only fate. Farina's delicate face was flushed with a sickly red. She suddenly thought, if Duque did not die in that blow just now, but was only half dead, such as having only the upper half of his body left, then she could personally lead him into the kingdom of the dead. Perhaps because she guided the most powerful Breaking Dawn Archmage to become a great lich, with such a merit, her position in the Calamity Army could be raised to a higher level. A second later, her pink pupils suddenly shrank. There was shock on her delicate face, and her pink shoulder-length hair trembled along with her body. What did she see? A shadow that should not exist. It was an amalgamation of shadow energy that was completely different from the overflowing energy. No one knew what it was, but it was obvious that it was not a natural creation. Under the gaze of hundreds of Undying, the shadow energy that seemed to be dissipating a quarter of an hour ago gathered together in the next instant, forming a standard human figure. Black hair, black facial features, black skin, and even black clothes. There was not a single part of this male wizard's body that was not filled with shadow energy. What made the Undyings even more alarmed was that the shadow elemental energy drifting in the surroundings actually began to gather on his body like rivers flowing into the sea. The amount of shadow elemental energy that poured into his body every second was enough to create 10 Breaking Dawn shadow archmages, but his absorption of shadow force seemed to be endless. Yes. He was Duke Marcus, the one who should have died to the shadow arrow rain a few seconds ago. Chapter 1252. Impossible. The Undyings who had wanted to watch a good show and pick up the bones of the strongest person in the Alliance to show off were all dumbfounded. That was shadow energy, after all. Compared to the positive energy of life, holy energy, shadow energy was widely recognized as the power of the dead. How could Duque ignore such a terrifying rain of shadow arrows? And he himself had shadow energy that was so powerful that even a commander-level expert could only look up to? What was going on? Not just the Death Knights, even Farina, who was still in the control room, was dumbfounded. At this moment, she had completely lost the ability to speak. Duque retreated from his shadow form and returned to his original appearance. His expression was completely indifferent. He smiled faintly, swept his gaze, and slowly said, "What other tricks do you have? While I'm still standing here, I haven't made a move. If you want to deal with me, at least you still have a chance. Once I make a move, I'm afraid you won't have the chance to deal with me anymore." Deep in the enemy's formation, it was as if he was taking a leisurely stroll. Facing a siege, he treated the enemies as if they were nothing. What kind of spirit and confidence was this? For a moment, almost every member of the Scourge army who had a brain was trembling. The ghostly fire in the Death Knight's eye sockets flickered. Farina's alluring body trembled uncontrollably. "Kel Thuzad, come to the main control room," Farina shouted in shock. But, there was no response. The magical message that should have been transmitted to the outside world suddenly collided with a layer of purplish-blue arcane energy outside the main control room. The arcane energy formed a larger cover, tightly wrapping the main control room. All the arcane elemental magic was absorbed by this cover. This was the crushing of a higher-level mystery over a lower-level mystery. As long as the level of magic did not surpass Duque, no one could use magic to send messages in such a limited space. Meisner. Meisner. Sound the alarm. Hurry up and inform Kel Thuzad. Farina grabbed a thick strand of spider silk in the main control room. As a leader of the spider area, she knew very well that as long as she pulled the spider's main stem, the big spider would definitely sense it immediately. However, even after pulling a dozen times, all of the fluctuations were like stones sinking into the sea, without a sound. Farina's heart sank. The door of the main control room suddenly collapsed with a loud bang. The huge and heavy thorium door landed on the ground, crushing the two Calamity skeleton warriors guarding the door into a pile of broken bones. Without hesitation, Farina cast Poison Arrow Rain with her left hand and Rain of Flames with her right hand. Both attacks were aimed at the gate. Logically speaking, this kind of terrifying poison magic was enough to instantly turn 50 hate beasts into a pool of pus. They would be finished in an instant, and not even their bones would be left. High-intensity flames also had a similar power. However, as one of Farina's few trump cards, these two spells were easily neutralized. Duque didn't even use any additional counterspells. He just stood at the gate and used Vast Ice Barrier to block the attack. Be it venom or flames, when these two spells blasted onto the shield, they were all swept aside by the ice tornado that moved in a clockwise direction. Duque even had the time to separate the poison from the flames and bounce them back. The venom, which emitted a strong stench, corroded all the mid-tier liches on Farina's left into lumps of unsightly bone mixture. The flames, which had dissipated quite a bit, burned the liches on her right into ashes. Even the ashes drifted away in the wind. Farina couldn't help but shiver. She had originally thought that if she could use the magic defense system to kill Duque, even if she succeeded, she would become a great hero of the Calamity Army. Dreams were beautiful, but reality was cruel. The defense of the main control room represented almost the strongest defense of Naxxramas. This was a defense system that could easily kill a Breaking Dawn-level powerhouse. If even this level of defense could not stop Duque, then other than Kel Thuzad, who might have some trump cards, no one in the whole of Naxxramas would be a match for Duque. Suddenly, Farina threw away the magic staff in her hand and raised her hands high in surrender. Then, she actually knelt down and prostrated herself to Duque. Don't kill me. I surrender. Her voice was clearly trembling with fear, but for some reason, Farina's voice sounded extremely charming. She also knelt in an ORZ posture. Because of the angle, when Farina raised her head and looked at Duque with pitiful eyes, from this subtle angle, Farina's exposed Mariana trench could be seen through the drooping collar. Not only was it white, but it also seemed to be bottomless. It really made people want to explore it. Looking down from above, the round buttocks were a strong visual impact. Great Alliance Commander, I surrender. The Alliance doesn't kill prisoners, right? I'm willing to do anything you want, even if you want me to become the lowliest servant in Marcus Mansion. I only ask the Great Alliance to spare my life. I am willing to offer my loyalty to you. As she spoke, her face became sad, and tears appeared at the corners of her eyes. Her pitiful temperament, coupled with her black lace robe that looked like a mourning dress, really fulfilled the old saying, if you want to be beautiful, you will wear a suit of mourning. Such a scene, if Duque did not know about Farina's background, he might really have been soft-hearted and chosen to die in order to complete the special achievement of Undead Collection. Duque strode forward, smiled coldly, and used his left hand to grab Farina's neck, raising her high. Cough cough. No. Spare me. This time, Farina was really scared out of her wits. She wanted to struggle, but she was afraid that her struggle would really anger Duque. Because she found that not only did Duque's left arm have the strength of a Tauren, but he was also strangling her neck. His thumb and index finger were pressing against her chin. Although the other fingers were also very strong, it was not to the extent that she could not breathe or speak. It was just uncomfortable. There's still a chance. When Farina gave up resisting and was about to continue to sell her body, Duque's voice reached her ears like a demon from hell. I didn't kill you immediately because I want you to die knowing the truth. Do you really think I don't know what you've done? You married 6 young nobles and killed them all without leaving a trace like a black widow spider. Through inheriting your late husband's family property, you became one of the richest women in Lordaeron during Tarina's reign. Farina's face instantly turned pale. No, this is all slander. I didn't kill them. Chapter 1253. Haha. Duque looked at Farina as if she was retarded. His black eyes, which seemed to be able to see through all the secrets in the world, made Farina feel guilty. No. It's true. They all died in accidents. Yes, accidents. That's true for people in this era. Otherwise, you wouldn't have changed 6 husbands in a row. So many people couldn't find anything wrong with you. Duque smiled. I have to say, when it comes to patience and creativity in killing, I really can't think of anyone who can compare to you. Farina's body trembled violently. For a moment, she wanted to use all the magic in her body to fight to the death. But she immediately realized that Duque's hand not only choked her neck, but also sealed all her magic circuits. Now she really became a weak woman who couldn't even fight a chicken. She could only continue to act pitiful. Your first husband actually had epilepsy. He would occasionally rush into the water by himself. You didn't use any magic. You only used a lot of psychological hints when he was asleep to induce the disease. As a result, he jumped into the river and drowned 3 days after the wedding. Farina trembled all over. Although she didn't know what epilepsy was, it was indeed a symptom. Your second husband was very fat. In fact, he always had high blood pressure and high blood cholesterol. So, when you got engaged, you kept rewarding him with a lot of cheese and high-fat food. As a result, he fell ill less than a week after the wedding. I didn't even touch your body before I died. Yes, for people in this era, there's no cure for heart disease caused by blood vessel blockage. Duque continued to tell them one by one. When he finished telling them the causes of death of Farina's 6 ex-husbands, the dark witch had already stopped trembling. If it weren't for her weak breathing, anyone would think that she was already a dead person. She knew that Duque would never let her go. Although Duque was known as the enemy of the queen, and almost all the queens in the world were rumored to have an affair with Duque, even if it was just a rumor, it still reflected how picky Duque's taste was. She was of low birth and had killed 6 husbands. With Duque's taste, how could he covet her beauty? It was laughable that she had thought that she could make Duque fall head over heels for her by surrendering and selling her beauty. She even thought that he would hand over the power of the alliance to her. Men conquer the world, women conquer men. This was an iron rule that she had tried and tested thousands of times. This time, it really hit a steel plate and directly smashed it into pieces. In the end, Farina asked, I want to know, what happened to Meisner? Duque smiled without saying a word. He simply tossed out a huge mandible from his interspatial bag. The mandible was still stained with fresh blood. With a little work, it could be made into a very barbaric 2-handed sledgehammer. It was the same in history, because that level 213 epic grade hammer was called Mandible. Farina was in despair. Completely and utterly in despair. She really could not imagine that Duque could actually silently kill off such a powerful beast leader who was the best at scouting. No wonder he could save her from under Kel Thuzad's nose. It turned out that the Scourge Fortress, Naxxramas, was like his own backyard in Duque's eyes. Without the hope of survival, the last layer of shame was torn off. Then there was no need to hide their hostility. Farina screamed hysterically, It's useless for you to kill me. My soul will return to the Lich King. Next time, I will return as the most powerful Lich. But remember. You ruined my beauty. You forced me to become a dirty and ugly undead. I will make you pay for this 1,000 times over. Ah, noisy. Duque snorted coldly. The Dark Witch could no longer speak. Her whole body was tightly wrapped in an even darker shadow power. The shadow power, which was shaped like a large black egg, frantically poured into her body. She resisted, but the shadow power still forced its way into her body. It was impossible for her body to withstand such a huge amount of shadow energy. In less than 3 seconds, her body had completely melted into the shadow energy. The evil Dark Witch Farina was dead. This was not the end. However, things did not go as she wished. Her soul returned to the Lich King's flag, waiting for the Lich King to wake up and grant her a new life. Then, she would become a powerful Lich like Kel Thuzad. Soon, a cold wind accompanied the soul. The next moment, Farina's soul emerged from the shadow power. She stared at everything in front of her with wide eyes, shocked and angry. She opened her mouth, but all that came out was a soundless roar. She tried to use all means to express her anger and dissatisfaction, but unfortunately, it was useless. In front of her seemed to be a huge and solid soul prison, completely sealing off all the power she had when she was alive. As soon as she looked up, she saw Duque's big face with a mocking expression outside the soul barrier. Yes. Compared to her soul, which had shrunk to the size of a palm, Duque's body was undoubtedly huge. Impossible. How did you do it? This is definitely not a mage's domain. Farina let out a shrill scream. According to the decibel, Farina's scream had already reached the level of Banshee's wail. Unfortunately, this was a soul prison that Duque had created. How could it be a trap for itself? Duque smiled and replied with the soul voice, "Sorry, your Doomsday Army's information on me is too outdated. Didn't anyone tell you that I obtained shadow power because I received Archimonde's Finger of Death in the Battle of Mount Hyjal?" As for the fact that Duque had become a Void Lord in the ancient war, the Burning Legion would not have exposed it if Duque had not mentioned it. Kill Jaden, who was deeply ashamed, would not have exposed it to Zul, who was still a pitiful soul slave at that time. Under the double concealment, this secret from 10,000 years ago became the straw that broke the camel's back for Farina. I won't. Farina had not finished speaking. Her soul had already been ignited like dry firewood. Her soul should not have felt anything, but she felt that the temperature of her body was rising rapidly, and a burning sensation spread throughout her body. She subconsciously took off her spiritual outer clothing, but even when her clothes were taken off, she did not feel the slightest drop in temperature. On the contrary, Farina felt as though her soul was being roasted in the mouth of an erupting volcano. The high temperature seemed to be able to burn her soul to ashes at any time and completely destroy it. No, Farina's soul screamed with all its might to vent the pain that came from the depths of her soul. Chapter 1254. Is it painful? Is it hopeless? If you want relief, it's good that you've surrendered to me. Duque stretched out a finger and easily broke through the soul barrier, gently poking Farina's spiritual belly. The shrunken soul of the Black Witch was now the size of a Barbie doll. Her entire body was burning with soul flames, and she instinctively wanted anything that could save her. Just like a drowning person who was on the verge of death, she would grab hold of anything that could save her. Farina immediately felt the cold breath from Duque's little finger. Without hesitation, she hugged it. The scene looked very strange. A doll-like soul of a beautiful woman hugged a pillar-like little finger, greedily seeking the cold breath from it. Huh? Are you using my finger as a pillow? Duque teased. But the next moment, Duque retracted his finger. Farina's soul crashed miserably against the soul barrier, and once again fell into the flames of soul punishment. She could not help but let out another painful scream and moan. Black Witch. Surrender to me, Duke Marcus. Otherwise, you will suffer in this eternal flame for at least 10,000 years. 10,000 years? No, spare me, I can't go on for another minute. Farina, who had turned into a little soul, cried and shouted. She decisively gave up what little restraint she had left. Was she a vicious woman? Yes. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been those classic 6 murders. Was she a person of strong will? No. She had strived to enter the upper class and enjoy the most extravagant life. She had never been someone who could endure hardship. After realizing that her soul could no longer escape, and that she had no choice but to endure the most terrifying soul punishment, the only thing she could do now was to shake at the master of this prison, the master of Duque, who also controlled her soul. Tail. Beg. Pity. Duque stuck his finger in again. The doll-like Farina hugged Duque's little finger and kissed it madly. She couldn't wait to show Duque her most precious thing. Of course, she was not referring to her delicate body that had seduced countless young male nobles from the Rotterdam. Instead, she was referring to the information about the Calamity Army. Of course, Duque could use the soul-searching technique. The problem was that the soul-searching technique could only be used when there was a huge difference in soul power. It was very easy for a leader to make a mistake. For example, if the other party's willpower was strong enough, it was very likely that they would obtain nothing, or perhaps they would obtain a fragmented piece of soul information. For example, even if Arthas killed his own master, Uther, he would not be able to do anything to Uther's soul. Therefore, making the other party yield was the most ideal. Duke Marcus. I, Farina, beg for your mercy. Please allow me to become your loyal soul slave. At your service. I will burn them for you. The doll-like Farina hugged Duque's finger, yearning for the cold touch. At this moment, after she poured out everything she knew that there was no turning back. No matter what the reason was, Kel Thuzad and the Lich King Arthas would not spare her. Because what she had given him was the secret list of the cursing sect spies in the Alliance. Haha. Consciousness. All right, you shall be my elemental emissary. This time, Duque was really satisfied. Praise you. Great Master, Farina opened up her soul, allowing Duque's shadow power to invade every corner of her soul. Now, the only thing she desired was to be completely conquered by him, to satisfy her empty and frightened soul. Because of betrayal, she desired a stronger backer and stronger power. It sounded very ironic, right? However, as the shadow power continued to pour in, Farina's previous pursuits and misgivings about the Calamity Army had all disappeared from her mind. She was like the most loyal hound, longing for the orders from her master. As the shadow power strengthened her soul, she moaned in agony, praying for the arrival of the master's orders that symbolized happiness. When Farina came back to her senses, she found herself back in the main control room, facing dozens of flashing magic mirror screens. Duque was still standing in front of her with a smile. She raised her hands in shock and found that her body was still there. I'm fine? Farina asked herself in shock. The next second, she realized that her body had changed. She was still breathing. She was still alive. However, the thing that kept her alive was no longer her heart and brain. It was the shadow energy lurking in her heart and every bone in her body. Apart from her life signs, she was already a shadow elemental life form in her bones. Moreover, at least half of her soul was in Duque's hands. She could clearly feel this. Suddenly, her body trembled. Her mouth twitched, but she still lowered her head and said to Duque, Master. Good. You know what I'm going to do, right? The Dark Witch was very smart. She immediately understood. I can't order commander-level beings. Duque didn't mind. As long as all the other troubles are gone. Understood. The Dark Witch took a deep breath and turned around. She was once again the temporary commander of Naxxramas. All undead, pay attention. We must gather our forces and drive out the damn alliance in one fell swoop. 3rd Death Knight Squad, hurry to E3. 5th Abomination Squad, go. Farina methodically ordered all of Naxxrama's troops to gather in the direction of the Skybreaker. At first glance, there seemed to be nothing wrong with her command. But when you considered that she had even sent away the troops that were fighting with the two Alliance powerhouses, it was a bit of a joke. Damn it. What's going on? Is that stupid woman just going to let those Alliance powerhouses come and go? The Death Knights who were about to snipe Magni and the others couldn't help but curse. Follow orders. Copies. Aren't the 4 Death Knights guarding the military zone? The Death Knights were all knights and even holy knights when they were alive. They had inherited their martial arts and military discipline. No matter how unwilling they were, they still chose to follow orders. In the end, the Alliance heroes saw the surging undead army retreat like the tide. What the hell? Magni muttered. The powerhouses all looked at each other. At this time, the Alliance near the Skybreaker had a deeper understanding. When the Skybreaker's captain, Justin Barrett, saw that the enemy had gathered almost all of their forces here, his face turned green. Who knew that in the next moment, Naxxrama's would change drastically? Chapter 1255. Seeing so many Death Knights, abominations, and even Frost Dragons swarming over, the hundreds of elite professionals of the Alliance had already given up on any hope of survival. At this time, the most urgent order to retreat came. Retreat? Immediately? The leading professional still wanted to persist, but he heard Justin's roar, "Don't be stubborn. Commander Marcus is going to use his ultimate move. If you don't want to die with bones, get back here. I'll cover you with artillery fire." Those who dared to attack Naxxrama's were all men of steel. Many of them were the core members of the Silver Dawn. Perhaps they had all imagined that if they failed and were killed, they might even become the hated undead. But as long as they were still alive, they would fight for their families, for their kingdom, and for this world. They were not afraid of death, but they were afraid of dying meaninglessly. If they had to retreat for the sake of retreating, they would rather die. If it was about Duke Ku's ultimate move, then it would really be laughable. His ultimate move had been praised by countless people. The earliest was during the first battle at the Dark Portal, when he burned down Stormwind City and conveniently buried 100,000 orcs. Every single professionist shivered and quickly retreated. At this time, the fiercest cannon sound came from the Heaven Breaker. Fire all the cannons. It doesn't matter even if the cannons explode. As long as we can save the brave warriors of the Alliance, it will be our victory. Justin shouted. The dwarf cannoneers naturally fired with all their might. Ignoring the hot cannoneers that retreated from the cannons, the dwarf cannoneers used God's descent to throw and load the cannoneers. They didn't need to aim, since the cannoneers wouldn't be able to hit them at such a close distance. For a moment, the roar of the cannons and the huge smoke almost enveloped the entire Heaven Breaker. The ship couldn't be seen anymore. While the cannons suppressed the undead army, the elites of the Alliance quickly retreated along the Iron Chain Bridge. They barely managed to retreat 90%. At this time, the Iron Chain Bridge on the side of Naxxrama's shook violently, as if it was hit by a violent earthquake. Suddenly, the entire flying fortress shook. On the Heaven Breaker, which relied on its propellers to keep itself afloat, the Alliance soldiers were able to see everything even more clearly. Outside the undead fortress of Naxxrama's, a giant skull that was either a decoration or a magical creation began to slide down the slope of the fortress. As the gigantic skeleton sculpture that was the size of 2 football fields fell, the undead army that was about to besiege the Alliance's elites fell. Just like broken building blocks, the trapezoidal area that was filled with Death Knights and abominations and other high-level undead actually followed the skeleton carvings and peeled off from the Naxxrama's fortress. The whole thing fell downwards, and it was still the Ankh-Karaj temple below. Ah, this was not a scream. The undead didn't have the emotion of fear. It was the Death Knights who were cursing. The Death Knights were pitiful. They weren't Frost Dragon Knights. The proud dragon race wouldn't be willing to be ridden by humans or other species even after they died. In the end, the Death Knight was in despair. He was riding an undead warhorse that could not fly. Right now, he was at least 500 meters from the ground. With his shadow magic power, if he was skilled enough, he could activate Death's Grasp in time to catch something when he was about to fall to the ground. Then, the Death Knights probably wouldn't break their legs. The undead warhorses would definitely break their leg bones. As for the abominations, they could only pray for themselves. Falling from such a height of 500 meters, they would probably be crushed into meat paste. Without their warhorses, the combat power of the Death Knights would drop by at least 30%. Under such circumstances, if they were to face the never-ending bug nest in despair, it would really be laughable. This is. Almost every Alliance warrior had a look of utter shock on their faces. It seemed that the love-hate relationship between the Scourge Army and the Bug Army wasn't enough. This time, they didn't even give the Scourge Army a way out. Justin saw something. He said vaguely but mysteriously, "It seems that the Heaven Breaker will have to come to Naxxramas often in the future." In the main control room, curses came from almost every communication circuit, as well as reproaches from the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. However, Farina ignored all of them. In the name of the commander, she pulled all the remaining troops of the Scourge Army to the edge of the area, and then stripped the entire building area in the name of damage to the area. The entire stronghold was quiet. Farina knelt down, prostrated herself on the ground, and said in the most respectful tone, "Great Master Marcus, now except for the spider eggs that have not yet hatched in the spider area, and a small number of remnants who refused to obey orders just now, the stronghold is relatively clean." Duque suddenly wanted to laugh. Laugh if you want to laugh. Ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha. Duque's arrogant laughter echoed throughout the entire main control room. At his feet, Farina shivered and could only put on a smile. Because she really couldn't figure out what this new master, who seemed to take every possibility into account, was thinking. This time, Duque really made a profit. Originally, he thought that Kel Thuzad would most likely give command to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Unfortunately, there weren't so many hypotheses in the world. If it weren't for Kel Thuzad seeing that Farina was the backbone of the cursing church and one of the few rational high-ranking leaders, the command of Naxxramas would not have fallen into her hands. In terms of pure commanding ability, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were much stronger than her. Why her? Because the Death Knights were destined to be loyal to Arthas. Kel Thuzad was loyal to the Lich King, but he also had his own little calculations. It was just that now he had shot himself in the foot. As expected, Kel Thuzad's exasperated voice suddenly appeared in the main control room along with his projection. That was true. If Kel Thuzad couldn't sense such a big thing when several building areas of the stronghold fell off, then he wouldn't be worthy of being called the Lord of Naxxramas. Farina. You idiot. What did you do? Almost as soon as the projection of the Great Lich appeared, Farina was like a frightened rabbit, hiding behind Duque with incomparable agility. She didn't have the guts to lie on Duque's back or pull on Duque's cloak. She just knelt on Duque's back, trying to make her existence as small as possible, hoping that Kel Thuzad would ignore her. Unfortunately, how could Kel Thuzad not see her? His red eyes suddenly brightened. Duque? Farina, you traitor. Chapter 1256. Chairman Kel's sharp scream made Farina's body tremble like a pendulum. She looked up at Duque, her voice full of pleading. Master, she was not disappointed this time. Duque flung the brilliant cloak in his hands. The purple cloak with yellow trimmings covered Farina's shoulders. Duque's gaze was still full of disdain, but the meaning was clear. Although you are despicable and I look down on you, since you are working for me, I will still protect you. For some reason, Farina suddenly felt a sense of peace. At least this new master did not burn the bridge after crossing the river. He forced her to cheat her old boss, the Scourge Army, and then heartlessly abandoned her. Farina, you bitch. I knew you were unreliable. I should have killed you long ago and destroyed the beauty you are so proud of, so that you would give up and work for the Scourge Army. Kel Thuzad's words were full of viciousness and cruelty, and the Black Witch's heart trembled. However, he changed the topic. Duke Marcus, you are indeed a lady killer. I didn't think. Duque was embarrassed. Wait. You said I cheated you, I admit it. But don't make it sound like I am so hungry that I can't be choosy. Kel Thuzad, Farina. At this moment, Farina only wanted to find a hard piece of black bread to knock herself to death. She, who boasted of her beauty and mingled with the nobles of Lordaeron, was belittled for the first time. But she could not refute it. Firstly, Duque was her absolute master, and secondly, Duque had good taste. Sigh. Comparing oneself to others would only make one angry. She was so bitter that she could not vent her anger. Even if she had internal injuries, she could only continue to hold it in. Because she still needed Duque's protection. Of course, Duque did not care about the Black Witch's feelings. His face was full of sarcasm. Kel Thuzad, put away your boring threats. You'd better stay on the upper floors. Once I'm done with your lackeys, it'll be your turn. With that, Duque waved his hand and Kel Thuzad's shadow disappeared. After a second, Duque turned to Farina and said, all right, Kel Thuzad has already sent word of your betrayal back to the Ice Crown Fortress. As soon as Arthis wakes up, she'll receive this good news immediately. This was the so-called way of controlling his subordinates and the heart of an emperor. He knew that Farina wasn't a good person, but he still accepted her. Of course, it was impossible that he didn't have a backup plan. What Duque was doing now was the same as when he took in Majordomo Executus in the Molten Core. Regardless of whether he was sincere or not, as long as he cut off his path of retreat and left behind a super archenemy that could destroy him at any time, as long as his archenemy was not reduced to ashes, he had to maintain his loyalty to Duque. In the face of Duque's coercion, how could Farina refuse? Not only did she kowtow loudly, but she also passionately kissed Duque's boots. Well, only the lowliest subjects, or serfs, who had committed a crime, would do this when they bowed to their lord. In the past 5 years, after Tarina's death, this sort of thing was no longer popular in the alliance. Duque didn't refuse Farina's bow. He couldn't let his guard down when dealing with a black widow like this. It wasn't that he couldn't reward her with a sweet date after a slap, but he couldn't be too quick. Duque grabbed her long pink hair and said, all right, there's nothing for you to do here. Go back to Karazhan and listen to Khadgar. I'll call you if I need anything. Duque directly opened a portal and threw Farina in. Then, he gave Khadgar a few instructions and turned his attention back to the main control room. Duque entered a series of commands on the control panel. Up up down down left right Alibaba. Aya, this series of commands made Duque sigh. Normally, before he transmigrated, only uncles in their 30s would know this series of commands even without Google. Of course, this series of commands still faithfully fulfilled its purpose. Suddenly, the entire main control room flashed, and all the undead language was erased. Instead, a line of even more ancient and sacred words appeared on the screen. This was not an exaggeration. Indeed, every special word and symbol exuded the power of holy light. After all, this floating fortress was a Titan creation left behind by the Pantheon. If it were anyone else, they would probably be at a loss. However, Duque, who had been to the ancient war and had secretly seen a lot of valuable first-hand information from the Burning Legion, could easily use the system to translate it. Please enter the verification code for the ultimate permission rewrite. If it were anyone else, they would definitely be at a loss. But Duque knew what it was. A permission could only be overwritten by a higher permission. This was why Sargeras' betrayal of the Pantheon had caused such a huge casualty to the Titans. Sargeras was a member of the Titans, and his main profession was combat, so his authority was very high. He annihilated his compatriots while plundering the authority of the other Titans. Therefore, a considerable part of the precious heritage of the Pantheon fell into his hands. Now, the Lich King Zul was actually just a little traitor without any Titan authority. Of course, he would not have the authority of the Titans' creations. On the contrary, Duque had it. Because no matter how it had been modified, his spiral sword, Duque's moral integrity, was essentially a derivative of the Quell Zarum, created by the Titans themselves. When Duque took out the spiral sword and inserted it into a hole in the control panel that rose from the ground, the text on the fortress's system screen suddenly changed. Detected the forging traces of Forger Kaziguros. Detected the enchantment mark of Dreamweaver Norganon. Confirmed the highest authority. After detection, the holder of the highest authority is not of the Titan race. Please state your identity, holder of the highest authority. A few minutes before inserting the sword, Du was still in a shadowy form, a black man that could not be any darker. Now, Duque's whole body was bathed in golden light. At first glance, he looked like the most holy saint. Duque began his performance in the Titan language analyzed by the system with an incomparable tone of a charlatan. Yes, I am not a Titan. But I am the heir of the Titan's will. I obtained the great Quell Zarum by chance, which is the derivative of the Iskani Punisher. From this moment on, I understand my destiny. I am willing to inherit the will of the great Pantheon and protect planet Azeroth for the Pantheon. And I solemnly promise that as long as any Titan from the Pantheon except the traitor Sardras comes, I will unconditionally hand over the highest authority of this fortress. Chapter 1257. Duque's words were righteous, awe-inspiring, and selfless. Those who didn't know would be moved by Duque to the point of tears and snot flowing down their faces. Not only did he openly confess his lowly identity, but he also promised that once the master came, he would give up ownership. He was simply a living example of an honest and reliable young man in the new era. In fact, the above touching was all bullsh*t. Because only the transmigrators knew that the Titans of the Pantheon had all been killed by Sargerassa. They were all dead. But the Titans, as godlike existences, were also very powerful. They were dead, but they died very uncleanly, and all kinds of gods will remain in the world. It must be known that all high-grade Titan systems had their own intelligence. There was absolutely no good ending for forcibly taking it. Or it was like Kel Thuzad, who could use it, but couldn't obtain full authority. Once they encountered an existence with higher authority, they would be done for. So what if they died uncleanly? Didn't you hear Duque deliberately leave a verbal trap, emphasizing that he would only give up the authority if he came? Duque's system elf had evaluated that the control center of Naxxramas probably had the intelligence of a human 10-year-old child. Its intelligence was not high, but it absolutely abided by the rules left behind by the Titans. It would automatically make a choice in favor of the will of the Titans. Therefore, Duque's following words became the last straw that crushed its heart. The glory of the Pantheon is being tarnished by evil. Scan the interior of Naxxramas. Dirty undead creatures and savage arachnids are occupying this place. The glory left behind by the Titans has been tossed around until nothing is left. If the Titans saw this scene, they would be very distressed. I don't ask for permanent power, I just hope that before the great Titans come, the Duke Marcus family can become the temporary guardians of Naxxramas, and protect planet Azeroth with blood and life for the Pantheon. The fortress system was silent for a full 10 seconds before it replied, "Okay. Please put your palm on the console, I will record your physiological information." Huh. Duque put his left hand on it and immediately found that his middle finger was poked by something like a needle. Is this recording my DNA data? The gadgets of the creation Titans were indeed high-tech. The fortress system's voice sounded again. Data recording complete. The physiological, genetic, and soul core data of the temporary highest authority holder, Duke Marcus, had been recorded. From now on, I will complete all your orders that are not directed at the Pantheon. Welcome, Commander Marcus. Please give the order. Phew. At this moment, Duque finally let out a long sigh of relief. Done. There were a lot of good things in Naxxramas, but the best thing was not the equipment obtained from killing Kel Thuzad, or even the majority of the fragments of the artifact, Atish, legendary guardian staff, but Naxxramas itself. If one hadn't been to the distorted nether, they wouldn't have been able to truly feel the terror of the Burning Legion's Void Fleet. If it were the current version of the Skybreaker, it would probably be a moving target. Only the Dalajan could be considered the true backbone of air defense. Now, Duque had added a heavy bargaining chip to the alliance, the floating fortress, Naxxramas. In the future, if the planetary protection circle with the dragon aspect as the core collapsed, then Naxxramas could work together with the Dalajan to serve as the second barrier to Azeroth. At the very least, it could serve as a barrier to Stormwind City. Now that he had obtained the rights to the fortress, Duke naturally went all out to purify it. At this moment, the two teams of Alliance powerhouses, who were advancing cautiously, suddenly saw Duque's projection. Duque raised his right hand and made a very casual greeting gesture. Yo! I'm your family's Duque. Now I have control of the Naxxramas fortress. I'm ready to play purification and get rid of all those damn eight-legged eggs. You guys stay where you are. If you're afraid, just put on the mask I prepared for you. With that, Duque's figure disappeared. How long have we been here? That guy isn't a fake boss, is he? Gavin Rad routinely teased. Aurelia rolled her eyes at Gavin Rad. I'd rather believe that you're fake than think that Duque is fake. Sasha added, that's right. Kel Thuzad was a dead man when he was alive. He doesn't have a sense of humor like that. Gavin Rad was speechless. In the other team, Sylvanas was unsatisfied. Damn it, Duque used us as a cover again, and then went to do bad things in the dark? Tyrant, the high priest in a white robe, shrugged. When has he not been full of bad ideas, secretly causing trouble, and then maximizing the benefits? I just didn't think that he would actually be interested in someone else's fortress. Jaina looked Naxxramas up and down. The fortress that had been an eyesore suddenly became cute. Only after commanding a floating castle do I feel that my capital is so weak. I really want to pull Naxxramas over Kul Tiras. Kalia put her hands on her hips. Come on. In my opinion, Duque should either put this thing in the blasted land to guard the dark portal, or Stormwind City. None of us should fight over it. Kalia's words made sense, and the women were actually speechless. While the experts of the Alliance were chatting peacefully, in the various regions, with the hall as the unit, giant protective walls were descending. With a rumbling sound, the entire Naxxramas was cut into countless independent spaces. Then, either flames or freezing air that was close to absolute zero began to pour into these spaces from the pipes in every corner. Farina could raise spiders before, but she couldn't give them orders because their master was Meissner, who had been killed by Duque. Now, the focus of the cleanup was naturally the spider area. Whoosh! In the spider area, it was as if an active volcano was erupting, and flames were everywhere. A strong fire tornado spun in the huge space, connecting the sky and earth, not leaving any corner untouched. Those spider eggs were unlucky. Without their mother's care, there was a high chance that they wouldn't be able to hatch. Now, they were directly sucked in and turned into charcoal. Even the spider eggs buried deep in the thick gelatinous soil were forcibly dug out by the strong fire tornado and thrown in all directions. Most spiders weighing less than 100 kilograms were directly rolled up and slammed into the hard stone walls, first turning into large meat patties, then into charcoal. As for the heavier spiders, they were often hit by all kinds of flying debris. For example, a large tarantula's head was cut in half by a piece of tile, and it became a corpse before the fire tornado hit. The remaining 4 groups of bosses in the fortress were forcibly locked in by the huge isolation wall, unable to come out. Chapter 1258. What's going on? Blamo, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, asked in a deep voice. I have a bad feeling, Sir Zeliek said. Ever since Farina ordered all the troops to be mobilized to deal with the Heaven Breaker, I felt that it was very strange, the dwarf Death Knight, Lord Kurtaz, said in a low voice. Although I don't want to doubt my colleagues with the worst attitude, I'm sure that Farina betrayed the Scourge army. Otherwise, there's no way to explain why we're trapped and can't get any reply, the more experienced Death Knight, Baron Rivendare, said. Unable to drag Ashbringer Mograine down, Kel Thuzad could only pull Rivendare over, the leader of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. As the leader of the Four Horsemen, Rivendare's words were the final conclusion. The other three Death Knights looked at each other and Kurtaz made his move. Meteor. The huge skeleton staff was raised, and a large meteor fireball the size of a horse carriage suddenly appeared from the void, striking the huge isolation door with a terrifying momentum. Bang! The so-called thunder was loud but the rain was small. This was how the current situation was described. Kurtaz showed a bitter expression. No, the isolation door is too thick, and it's covered with King City-level magic protection spells. I can't break through it by force. It wasn't just the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the other bosses encountered the same problem. The structure area boss Thaddeus, who looked like a Frankenstein and was completely a giant, used up all of his lightning energy, but couldn't shake the door at all. In the Frost Dragon's lair, the Ice Dragon Sapphiron stood together with Kel Thuzad. The Ice Dragon watched Kel Thuzad cast one magic after another in vain. Damn it! Damn it! Why is it like this? Kel Thuzad was going crazy. The Frost Dragon's lair was clearly the core area of the entire stronghold. In order to prevent possible enemies from sneaking in, the Frost Dragon's area was specially sealed with a large three-dimensional magic formation, turning it into a special space that was almost completely independent from the stronghold. But now, the teleportation circle that was supposed to be unimpeded was sealed. Even though Kel Thuzad and Sapphiron were here, they could only watch helplessly. They couldn't do anything. That kind of anger, even though Kel Thuzad was an undead, made him feel like his soul was about to explode. It seemed that the remnants of the scourge in the stronghold would be defeated one by one. Since this would become a reality, Kel Thuzad understood that he had to do something. Otherwise, he would soon follow in the footsteps of his miserable subordinates and be dealt with by Duque. Kel Thuzad pulled out a scarlet flame from his chest, and his eyes glowed red. It seems that we have no other choice. Sapphiron, come with me. In the name of the great Lich King Arthas, I command you. Realizing what Kel Thuzad wanted to do, Sapphiron's remaining dragon instincts instinctively rejected Kel Thuzad. Unfortunately, before it was a dragon, it was already an undead. A great lich and a frost wyrm that only had bones left. They confronted each other for a full 5 minutes. In the end, the lich, who borrowed the name of the Lich King, won. Unwillingly and unwillingly, Sapphiron finally lowered its noble head. In the stronghold, after nearly an hour of marching, the two alliance teams finally met, and Duque also appeared when the two teams met. Holy light above, how did you do it? Tyrion Fordring asked Duque. Duque was not vague and directly explained the general process, which made the alliance powerhouses shout in surprise. What? This stronghold is actually a creation left behind by the Titans, and you used another Titan creation to control it? Jaina's eyes widened. Not to mention her, even the most imaginative person would not have thought that an enemy's stronghold could be dealt with in this way. Although strongholds were the easiest to break through from the inside, this was too easy. Duque smiled. Actually, long before I brought Naxxramas to the temple of Ankh-Kiraj and let bones and the insects fight non-stop, you should have known that I had a considerable amount of control over this stronghold. Why hasn't Kel Thuzad given up? Kalia was very timely and curious. Because I knew from the beginning that he was a gambling addict. As long as he could still gamble, he would never admit defeat. Duque's evaluation of Kel Thuzad was really right. In this world, there were always some people who thought that they were smarter than others, insisted on their own opinions and ideas, and refused any persuasion. They were determined to go all the way. Many years ago, when Antonidas discovered that Kel Thuzad, who was still a human, was conducting various taboo undead experiments, Antonidas used thunderous methods to stop his research. Later on, when Duque intervened, he ruthlessly tricked Kel Thuzad and severely injured his soul. But nothing could compare to Kel Thuzad's stubbornness. His stubbornness was so terrible that he didn't even hesitate to devour other souls to recreate a theoretically complete lich soul. He had been destroyed by Arthas once as a lich, and was resurrected again in the Sunwell. As long as he didn't achieve his goal, he dared to work hard again and again, to seek death. So Duque was very sure that Kel Thuzad would never be willing to give up Naxxramas, even at this moment, when Duque had successfully controlled Naxxrama's system. Duque curled his lips. Although I don't hate people who have principles and are willing to persevere to the end, as an enemy, he's too annoying. Okay, everyone, it's time to work. We'll go clean up the remaining 2 areas first, and then we'll deal with this despicable person who caused Arthas to fall. Duque's words made the eyes of several strong people from Lordaeron light up. Everyone began to move. At this time, Queen Sylvie came up. You subdued the enemy's commander, that black witch called Farina? Duque blinked. How did you know? Come on, every single Death Knight who fought with us was cursing her. I'm not deaf. I heard that this woman used to have a bad reputation in Lordaeron. Kalia nodded. Yeah, even I heard about it. Duque sighed and answered truthfully, well, that's true. But I shadowed her body and soul. Now she's my elemental emissary. Elemental emissary? Jaina was curious. I found that the demigod path I'm going to take is different from many demigods in the past. It seems that I'm going to gather the divinity of fire, ice, arcane, holy, and shadow. In order to reduce the burden on my body and soul, I'm going to set up 5 elemental emissaries whose souls are attached to me. Duque's whimsical ideas and practices shocked his women. Chapter 1259. 5 elemental emissaries? In other words, Duque was going to become a god with 5 powers at the same time? Was it really going to be that easy? Every woman was stunned by Duque's bold and arrogant words. In fact, Duque also had a portion of nature divinity from the Wind Prince, but Duque was a little uncertain about it. In Duque's mind, if he really couldn't handle it, he could strategically give up this portion of divinity, so Duque didn't mention it. After all, in Duque's impression, those who were good at nature were either druids or shamans, which didn't match his horoscope. Is that possible? When Jaina asked, her voice sounded like she was sleepwalking. Actually, it's possible. What I'm doing now is a bit similar to that of warlocks. It's just that warlocks obtain greater power through summoning and contracts, as well as share their burdens. As long as a warlock's soul is strong enough, he can theoretically summon several powerful summons at the same time. But you're not a warlock, and the mechanism is different, right? Jaina asked. It is indeed different. Duque nodded. But ever since I accepted Majordomo and the Molten Core and gave him some divine power, binding his soul and life to mine, I found that this is a very suitable path for me. At this time, Tyrant said, Duque, your choice is probably right. Even Elun can't easily release her power across time and space. Even God needs a spokesperson. For example, I am the High Priest. I can borrow Elun's power, and at the same time, I'm one of the cornerstones of her power. In terms of apatheicizing, Tyrant's opinion was far more convincing than others. For a moment, everyone didn't know what to say. Duque, can you handle it? Aurelia asked worriedly. I'm the best at multitasking. As he spoke, dozens of magic hands flew around Duque, and each magic hand made a different gesture. The girls looked at each other and saw each other's eyes. In the end, it was Aurelia who spoke. All right, Duque, you've convinced us. Jaina, then do you have a target for the elemental emissaries in your heart? Basically. Majordomo Executus was the fire element, and Farina was the shadow element. As for the rest, please allow me to keep it a secret for now. Aurelia gently pulled Duque's hand. It's good that you know what you're doing. Remember, don't force yourself. We all know that you seek a power that can protect Azeroth. But some things were better to let nature take its course. Even if you don't think about yourself, you should think about us. At this point, Aurelia's voice became softer. Especially, you don't even have a child. No matter how valiant and resolute the queens were in front of the people, all of them suddenly became bashful. Their faces were all red. Ah! Are there many ants on the ground? Ah. The patterns on the ceiling are so beautiful, needless to say, Aurelia and Sasha, who were the first to follow Duque. The four queens had long been whispering together, discussing how to hide it from the people below if Duque could not give them a status. Now even Tyron seemed to be talking to herself. I wonder if Alun will allow the high priest this. Duque was speechless. Well, my soul is a little special. It seems that I can only bestow souls upon my descendants when I become a demigod. All right. Hurry up and become a demigod. The 7 voices were so unified, and the 14 gazes were so passionate that it almost scared Duque. When the time comes, maybe when the world is at peace, we can even use Naxxramas as a palace to travel around the world, Kalia, who had the most girl's imagination, said in her sweet voice. Duque was stunned for a moment, and then immediately came back to his senses. Yes. Ever since his transmigration, his nerves had been stretched taut. His eyes were on the present, or on the future where the crisis of the world was becoming more and more imminent, but not on the longer-term future. What would happen after the Burning Legion was taken care of? Perhaps it would be a good choice to use the great Naxxramas as a flashy palace, and wander around wherever he went. Under Duque's mental command, Naxxramas opened part of the dome on the ceiling. It seemed that because of the sunlight penetrating through, the aura of death in the fortress was all driven away. The sunlight shone on the ancient walls that were like white powder, the deep winding corridors, the hooked staircases, the strange-looking statues, the wide and magnificent glass windows, the floating shadows, the clanking of the armors of Gavin Rad and the others in front, and finally the towering dome that always looked down on you, and always looked down on the reincarnation of history. All of this was playing out scenes from ancient and modern legends. He had not realized before that the architectural style of Naxxramas was actually quite artistic. This idea sounded quite interesting. A charming smile appeared at the corner of Duque's mouth. Seeing Duque smile, Kalia and the other girls also smiled faintly. Duque raised his right index finger and shook it. Don't think that I will easily raise a flag or something. Countless movies and animations have proven that the guy who says, after this war, I'll go back to my hometown to get married, will definitely die. Well, even if I die, I will still resurrect. So, Duque made an inscrutable smile, letting the girls think that they knew, and that would be good. The team continued to move forward because all the monsters had been dealt with by Duque, and this march was more like an armed parade. Soon, everyone arrived in front of the hall where the final boss of the construction area, Thaddeus, was. Do you remember the main points I said? You must remember, otherwise if you stand together with different polarities, then everyone will die together. Although I don't want to put pressure on everyone, there is only one chance to deal with this guy. Duque repeatedly emphasized. This was not a joke. Thaddeus, who looked like a Frankenstein, was himself a lich's test subject. This giant, which was sewn together from the severed limbs of many giants, had the power to control thunder and lightning. The most special and disgusting thing about him was that every once in a while, he would add an electric charge to the enemies that besieged him. Either it was a positive charge or a negative charge. Electric charges of the same polarity superimposed together would increase the attack power of all the companions around them. If electric charges of opposite polarity were stuck within 8 yards, then he. After adding the charge for 5 seconds, if the opposite polarity was still standing together, then there would be a chain of explosions. The power of the explosion was determined by the number of people around who were charged. If there were only 2 idiots standing together, then at most 2 would die. If it was a group of people, it would be a matter of an instant. Chapter 1260. Seeing that the atmosphere was a little heavy, Gavin Rad came to smooth things over. Yo, boss, you make it sound like we always have a way out when dealing with the enemy leader. Those who don't have the guts wouldn't have dared to come a long time ago. We've killed a few demigods, after all. Fine. You're awesome. Gavin Rad gave them a good beating, and the atmosphere in the team suddenly became much better. After clearing the mini-bosses on the 2 high platforms near Thaddeus, everyone cast their own spells and jumped from the high platforms to the platform where Thaddeus was. Of course, a certain dwarf king in the form of a winter melon had short legs and needed Duque to lift him up with hand of magic. He was still croaking and waving his hands in midair. "Help, please don't abandon me. I've done meritorious deeds for the Alliance, I've bled, you can't just throw me into the pool below. It's dirty and smelly. The grave of the great Magni Bronzebeard shouldn't be here." Duque, everyone, it had to be said that the Bronzebeard dwarves, who had always said that only rocks and iron or would never betray them, would become neurotic once their feet left the ground. "Sigh, you should learn how to ride griffins from your Wildhammer cousins," Duque complained. Bullsh *T. "Why don't you ask Kudrin to learn Avatar from me?" Magni cursed. Duque couldn't stand it anymore. Seeing that the team was almost in place, he directly threw Magni over. A dwarf that looked like a tin can suddenly crashed into Thaddeus the Frankenstein monster like a cannonball. The giant, who had been silent a moment ago, had his hard outer skin crack and fall off like cracked plasterboard. Having just woken up from a deep sleep, Thaddeus' voice made people feel that this giant was still in chaos. The next moment, the two huge spiral electric towers on the high platform were activated, and a huge amount of electricity was instantly injected into the body of this stitched giant. Even the naked eye could see the dazzling electric arcs enter the giant's body. "Please. Stop. Stop this thing. Help me, save me, no. No." Thaddeus' cry for help made several Alliance powerhouses hesitate. Obviously, Thaddeus was a tragedy. Everyone could not help but recall the Doomsday Army experiment diary that Duque had shown them from the fortress's system before the war. It was a nightmarish record. After suffering a disastrous defeat at Mount Hygel, Mount Hercules was not the only one in the world. The Doomsday Army looked through the video of the battle. Arthas, who was still a Death Knight at that time, coldly said, "Without the support of magic, my army of stitches will never be able to unify this world." She was clearly on the verge of death, but under the effect of a primitive druid's magic, the bear turned into a giant bear and slapped down the broken stitched monster. Today, these words were carved by Kel Thuzad's magic on the door of Naxxrama's laboratory. Countless scourge scientists worked hard for their master's arrogant plan to conquer the world. No matter how much you strengthened a stitched monster made of corpses, it would only be in terms of strength and sturdiness. If you wanted to use magic, you couldn't use corpses that already had no magic power. Since corpses can't maintain magic power, I'll just use living people as experiments. Master's will cannot be violated. We must speed up. Master is about to arrive in this world, we must give the new stitched monster to Master as a gift. Under Kel Thuzad's instructions, the minions of the Scourge were sent out to search for suitable test subjects, ogre mages, orc warlocks, human paladins, Tauren shamans, etc. However, the experiment was not successful. Arcane magic, shadow curses, and holy power disappeared without a trace once they came into contact with the plague. However, the power of the elements merged well with the plague virus. It was just that the test subjects did not mutate. They only had magic power, but did not have strong bodies. The new plague can't make the Tauren race mutate? Then let's use the perfect human structure and find a way to extract the power of the elements and fuse it with arcane magic. Under Kel Thuzad's guidance, there was a new improvement in the experiment. A human test subject named Thaddeus had the ability to attack with elemental lightning under the effects of the plague and arcane magic. However, after just one magic release, the stitched monster stopped moving. Can our technology only go so far? Although very disappointed, Kel Thuzad could only accept reality. Then build him a room and let him be the guard of my fortress to defend the dignity of the Lich King. The former paladin Thaddeus was now imprisoned in the dirty and dark Naxxramas, enduring both psychological and physical pain. His painful voice echoed in Naxxramas and lingered for a long time. "Help me. Save me." When the words in the video that lingered in the hearts of the strong once again echoed in their ears, Kalia finally couldn't take it anymore. Duque knew what the kind-hearted Kalia wanted to say, but he still shook his head. Not every soul poisoned by the scourge can be saved. Queen Sylvie shouted, "You're not planning to turn Thuzad into your elemental emissary, are you?" "Of course not." "That's good. How could Duque offend everyone and do such a thing?" At this time, the cracks on Thaddeus' skin had already been completed. What appeared in front of everyone was an absolute construct giant. Thaddeus' eyes were red as he said in a voice full of guilt, "You're too late. I can only obey." Duque's gaze passed through Thaddeus' heavy body and saw that incomplete and dirty soul. He finally sighed. "Do it." The flames of the divine weapon Balrog's hammer lit up first. With one hit from the hammer, Thaddeus' leg was charred black and deeply caved in. If it was a living creature, even if it was a dragon man, they probably wouldn't be able to stand up after receiving such damage. Unfortunately, Thaddeus was a stitched creature. His bones were made from the remains of giant dragons, and his muscles came from the fresh flesh and blood of many giants. Magni's fierce attack had only damaged the first layer of his flesh. The problem was that there was still a second layer, a third layer. Who knew which layer it was? Pfft! Magni spat fiercely. Gavin Rad's wind sword also slashed forward, but this time, the effect of the wind sword wasn't very good. Because Thaddeus also used the power of lightning. Gavin Rad instinctively felt that his wind sword was simply helping to charge this thing. He could only immediately put away the wind sword and replace it with an epic-grade hammer that was more effective against constructs. Chapter 1261. Sigh. Anyone who had ever played with magnets knew that like repelled and opposites attracted. It would be so easy if they could do the same with Thaddeus. The problem was that they couldn't. When Duque led a party in the game, he could scold the fools who ran to the positive pole with negative charges. After all, it was absolutely common for a party to be wiped out, and they would get used to it. In addition, being wiped out was a bit like the accumulation of pleasure from practicing the sword. After spending time, effort, intelligence, and sweat, once the boss was successfully defeated, that kind of accumulated pleasure would burst out in one go, almost burning one's brain. It was really hard to describe with words. Ahem. However, striving to succeed in one go like this also had a different kind of thrill, like walking on a tightrope. At first, Duque didn't feel anything, but he was immediately greeted with his first shock. Suddenly, all the powerhouses felt the change in the air. Some felt their hair stand on end, while others even had their hair stand on end. Well, Theon's mother had suddenly turned into an afro. Duque immediately realized what was going on. Obviously, the electric charge had fallen. But this was the real world of Azeroth, not a game. So even if the powerhouses could sense the charge, it didn't matter if their knowledge of physics was zero. People couldn't judge positive and negative charges with the naked eye. Duque was startled, and immediately had the system genie get to work. Immediately analyze the positive and negative charges and mark everyone's head with a phantom symbol. Use a red plus sign for positive poles and a blue minus sign for negative poles. Duque's order immediately gave the powerhouses a clear direction. Even though the situation was chaotic, the guy with the negative pole symbol on his head still ran around Thaddeus, who was attacking Magni, and ran to the area designated by Duque. All sorts of things happened. Benedicus seemed a little confused. He was clearly a positive pole, but he actually ran out too. Queen Sylvanas was quick to react and grabbed him. Then, in her panic, the negative Kalia actually stepped on her own mage robes and fell down. Moreover, she fell less than 5 meters away from the positive faction. Time seemed to have frozen. Even Kalia's beautiful face was frozen with fear. At the critical moment, Duque made his move. A mutated, Bigby's Vajrapalm, was pushed out, and Kalia felt her entire body fly out as light as a feather. It felt as if she was riding on a cloud. Then, in less than a second, she had already landed gently in the crowd of negative poles. Phew. More than one person let out a long sigh of relief. This was also a reality. In the game, there wasn't a single pharaoh who could use mathematical sorcery to save his teammates. It didn't matter how many there were. If the idiot acted foolishly, the whole team would be buried with him. 5 seconds seemed like a long time, but in reality, 2 blinks of an eye had passed. Fortunately, all 15 of them were in position. Everyone was surprised to find that under the amplification effect of the same polarity electric charge, their attack power and healing ability had actually increased by several times. Hey! This feels great. This time, when Magni swung his hammer down in a circle, he realized that Thaddeus' stick-like finger had been knocked away. As a warrior, he had always taken on the most difficult task of tanking the boss. When would he be able to bully the boss like this? Mag was feeling really good. Come on. Eat my hammer and continue to hurt each other. The Balrog's hammer brought up clouds of fire. The visual impact of the intense light and shadow made people forget that this fellow was actually a defensive warrior who was tanking the boss. There was also Gavin Rad like him. Unfortunately, the wind sword was silent, so he couldn't be. Of course, most heroes fought in silence in their own way. Against abominations or constructed enemies, the ranger's attack power was usually greatly reduced. This was because these large undead creatures didn't have any so-called weak points or weak points. The power of arrows couldn't compare to close-range weapons of the same level. However, the Windrunner sisters used their unparalleled archery to create a disassembly-style tactic. Since even the abomination's eyes and throat were just decorations, they simply didn't care about anything else and focused on shooting the abomination's stitches. In the midst of Thaddeus' fierce attacks and dazzling lightning, to shoot a small stitches didn't just require the ability to shoot hundreds of steps away, it also required astonishing accuracy. Otherwise, an arrow that went astray could very well become Thaddeus' protection. The Windrunner sisters did it. They were like a butcher dismembering an ox, constantly disassembling Thaddeus' entire body. While the close-range warriors were still busy shooting off who knew how many layers of this Frankenstein's leg, they were shocked to find that the flesh on Thaddeus' upper body was falling off. When they looked up, they could see that he had already lost 3 sizes of his body. This was possible. The 3 sisters clearly didn't even have a divine weapon, but their damage output was the highest in the entire team. With just the 3 of them, they had shaved this big guy into a roly-poly doll. They drew their bows, nocked their arrows, and took small quick steps with their elegant and slender legs. Even if they needed to change their polarity, they still maintained their attacks while the other heroes were busy running around. The 3 sisters used the most elegant fighting stances to illustrate the art and aesthetics of battle. The beauties were like a painting, and the arrows were like a rainbow. Even the most picky heroes couldn't help but reveal a look of admiration in their eyes. It was already an honor for a man to have one of such valiant heroines, not to mention that Duque had all 3 sisters. Gavin Rad was excited. "Boss, I heard that the Windrunner family's Lilith is still unclaimed." As soon as he said that, the 3 sisters turned their eyes at the same time and glared at him with murderous eyes. They were clearly saying, "You, Gavin Rad, aren't qualified." As the boss, Duque was also helpless. The palm of his hand was flesh, and so was the back of his hand. He couldn't open a harem for himself and not open one for his lackeys, right? What's more, Gavin Rad had his eyes on Lilith, who was originally a cute and tragic boy in history. If you can't even get past your sister-in-law, who's to blame? Since he had no hope, Duque could only send him on his way. Just in time for the polarity change. Gavin Rad, as a positive polarity, stood out in the middle of a group of negative polarities. He was already prepared to run, but Duque didn't say anything and just kicked him with an arcane Hong Kong kick. Gavin Rad, who hadn't made any mistakes in his previous runs, was caught off guard and sent flying into the group of positive polarities. "Boss, what are you doing?" Duque stuttered and replied slowly, "I suddenly realized that you're lacking in IQ. I was afraid that you wouldn't know how to run, so I sent you on your way." At this moment, Gavin Rad completely gave up. Chapter 1262. Kill. I'll crush your bones. I'll smash you. Let's taste the pain together. Thaddeus' roars continued throughout the entire battle. If one listened to the sound and didn't look at the situation, perhaps outsiders would think that Thaddeus had the upper hand. Only by seeing it with their own eyes would they know that this once incomparably burly, giant-like Frankenstein with a muscular appearance was now almost a skeleton king. The powerful abomination suture thread was made from the most powerful and sturdy shadow force threads, difficult for normal blades to cut through to begin with. However, before the 3 Windstalker sisters' sharp arrows, all of the suture threads were cut with a noise. Without the support of the sutures, Thaddeus' huge body, which was more than 10 meters tall, was disintegrating piece by piece. Theon's Ashbringer didn't have a good effect on Thaddeus' body, but when it slashed at the falling pieces of flesh, the golden light of Ashbringer easily destroyed the pieces of flesh and turned them into ashes. It was precisely because of this situation that everyone felt a sense of confusion and sorrow as they listened to Thaddeus' furious roars that they couldn't figure out what was going on. Thaddeus, who had lost his muscles, also lost his powerful strength. If he could have flattened a steam tank with one slap at the beginning, now he could only make a dent at most. His power storage also plummeted, and the chain lightning that was blasted out, with the high magic resistance of the experts, could only hurt them a little, not cause any damage. Benedicta's and Kalia could be healed with Restore. Theon didn't stop and suddenly said, "Thaddeus, I remember he was from the second batch of paladins." Gavin Rad put away his cynicism. "Yes, Uther personally brought him." Theon sighed. "I feel uncomfortable thinking that the more powerful the paladin, the more powerful they will be after becoming a Death Knight. At least the commander didn't fall." The commander that Gavin Rad mentioned was naturally Uther, the former commander of the Silver Hand. The fall of every paladin was the death of the Holy Light doctrine. Why was it that the more devout the clergy, the more terrifying they would be after they fell? This was already a sorrow that no one in the Church of Holy Light could answer. They believed in light and eventually embraced darkness, becoming an even more terrifying opposite. From Arthas to the other 3-4 horsemen of the apocalypse to Thaddeus. An ominous cloud shrouded the Holy Knights. None understood why, but if life was to continue flourishing in this world, the clergies were fated to carry their doubts and keep moving forward. Beside him, Duque also sighed. "Let's end this." That's right. It was time to end this. Suddenly, Tyrion Fordring took advantage of the moment when Gavinrad's sanction hit Thaddeus in the head and knocked him out, whose resistance had been greatly reduced. Tyrion Fordring performed a dragonfly's triple sweep of the water. He ignored the heavy armor on his body, which weighed more than 100 kilograms, and actually used the pelvic bone that Thaddeus spat out after cutting off his body as leverage. He stepped on the giant's back 3 times in a row and flew to the back of Thaddeus' neck like a cloud. This was the first time Ashbringer had used his full strength in this battle. The dazzling golden light used the height of 8 meters as a dividing line, dividing the entire area into 2 levels. The lower level was filled with scattered lightning, while the upper level was only left with the purest holy golden light. The broad blade of the sword slashed fiercely at Thaddeus's spine, and everyone could hear the crisp cracking sound. However, this strike was still unable to behead Thaddeus. Go! Duque directly used Bigby's Vajra fist to hit the sole of Magni's foot. Magni, who was in his normal state, directly activated Deity's descent in midair. It looked like he directly rose into the air with his huge body and flew to a place level with Thaddeus' head. Lose your head dash, in terms of proportion, the thick and short arms swelled to the extreme. The Balrog hammer, which was already 10 times larger than usual, once again condensed from flames into substance, turning into a huge red-black warhammer full of spikes, and smashed viciously into Thaddeus' iron chin. The already cracked cervical vertebra finally couldn't withstand this ultimate level of attack. The huge head turned more than 360 degrees and finally flew into the air. The final boss of the construction zone, Thaddeus, killed. The experts were supposed to be happy about this. However, when Thaddeus' head fell to the ground and he said his last words, everyone was silent. That was because that was the last words of a holy knight who had regained his sanity as a monster-like existence. "Thank you, his heart was suddenly blocked by something, and it felt heavy and stuffy. His ears seemed to be covered by a layer of membrane, and everything was hazy. His nose felt like it was blocked, and he couldn't breathe. If Thaddeus was a bastard like Baron Rivendare who took the initiative to fall, then even a kind holy knight would be happy to see his end. Unfortunately, he wasn't. In fact, everyone knew from the start that this was likely to be the case. Everyone tried to use a more relaxed atmosphere to get through this difficult battle. However, in the end, they couldn't help but feel dejected. They could feel that Thaddeus' soul was starting to dissipate. Perhaps this was a form of release for him. However, for the living, this was like a new, heavy shackle. In order to continue forward, they had no choice but to bring even heavier shackles with them on the journey. Gavin Rads suddenly sighed. I suddenly understand why Arthas fell back then. Yes, that's right. He was originally a holy knight with a kind heart. His pure holy light and perfect aptitude as a holy knight said it all. And then? The Scourge used their schemes to tie shackles and shackles on his heart, making his footsteps heavier and his soul more and more tormented. When the young prince's soul broke through its limits, when obsession replaced the belief of justice and became the master of the soul, then the final fall would inevitably come. Everyone was sighing. Everyone was sighing. Kalia quietly walked to Duque's side and pulled on Duque's sleeve, pleading softly, I always tell my believers and subjects that if they believe in justice and love, they will usher in a beautiful future. But now, if even I don't believe in the future of the holy light, how can I ask them to believe in it? Aurelia also spoke up, Tyrant, is there anything you can do? Tyrant shook her head slowly, Elune cannot guide souls that do not believe in her. In the end, it was Duque who stepped forward and stretched out his right hand. Chapter 1263. On each of Duke's fingers, there were rings of lightning circling around each of his fingers. His 10 fingers were like a pianist who had stepped onto a stage, sat on a chair, and was about to start playing. With the movement of his fingertips, groups of incomparably mysterious magic runes jumped out from his fingers. These runes surrounded Thaddeus' huge head, and Jaina and Elusia were sensitive enough to notice that these runes formed a small magic array that was separating Thaddeus from the surrounding space. It was even possible that it was stripping away the connection between the sleeping Lich King and Thaddeus. This is... Elusia covered her mouth in disbelief. Jaina grabbed her good sister's hand with one hand. Watch carefully, how a true master tries to solve an unknown and difficult problem with brand new magic techniques and arrays. Using mature magic was one thing. No matter how complicated or difficult the magic was, it was just following the script. As long as one had enough magic power and magic application skills, they could successfully make the magic circuit in the body communicate well with the elemental channels in the outside world. Basically, it was something that could be improved through more practice. But not now. Everyone could see that because of Kel Thuzad's inhumane and taboo experiments, Thaddeus' soul had been seriously polluted and distorted. It could not even be simply classified as a human soul. Among Thaddeus' soul, there were also other kinds of souls, such as the mountain giant and the twin-headed ogre mage. This unstable combination was the key to Thaddeus' physique that could not be replicated and could store lightning. Thus, from the beginning to the end, except for the overly kind-hearted Kalia, no hero had suggested that Duque save Thaddeus. This was absolutely forcing him to do something he couldn't do. Similarly, not many people knew that Duque had the ability to control souls. After all, someone had infiltrated the Burning Legion and become a Void Duke. This was a dark history, an ancient secret. In fact, with Duque's strength, any incantations and chants were not necessary. But considering the following scene, thinking of his own magic power, it was very likely that the upper limit of everyone's perception of him would be refreshed. Duque still pretended to chant the incantation. Declare, show me. A soul that shines with divine radiance at the end of hell. I have already glimpsed the 3 great virtues that haunt thee. I already know the meaning that fate has given to your sword. If you obey the holy light, obey this will, obey this path, then answer my call. I hereby swear, I am the one who accomplishes all the good in the world. I am the one who cuts off all evil in this world. In the name of the guardian of the scales of justice, Duke Marcus. Regardless of whether these words had any meaning, just the declaration that accompanied a certain person's copy and adaptation from the long night of destiny, coupled with the increasingly dazzling brilliance of the runes around it, was at least full marks. No one knew what it was. Even Jaina couldn't understand the magic circle or the real function of the incantation. However, this didn't stop everyone from feeling a sense of awe. This was especially so for Kalia, who worshipped Duque so much. Her eyes were practically the standard starry eyes of a starchaser. As soon as Duque finished the last word of the incantation, a semi-illusory mass of matter, or rather, a combination of souls, rose from Thaddeus' big head and floated in the air. To outsiders, even Thaddeus' soul, which had been forcibly materialized by Duque's mental power, looked no different from a mass of black mud. It could be said that it was sesame paste, it could be said that it was shit, or it could be said that it was the darkest evil of depravity. Others would feel disgusted just by looking at it, unable to tell which part was which. However, with the help of the system elf, Duque could analyze the soul's energy and magnify it 10,000 times. Theon, Gavinrad, Kalia, Benedictas, please stand in one direction and purify the excess filth. Duque's request was immediately carried out. They stood in 4 directions, east, west, south, and north, and formed a simple holy light purification magic circle further out. A pair of golden palms, identical to the shape of Duque's palms, appeared out of thin air next to Thaddeus' soul. 10 golden fingers flew up and down, dispelling the black part of the soul with the holy light of the soul. If the archery of the 3 Windrunner sisters was like a butcher dismembering an ox, rapidly dismantling Thaddeus' body. At this moment, Duque was using an even more incredible and mysterious method, as if performing a surgical operation, to remove the impurities in Thaddeus' soul. As soon as the dark soul matter was removed, the soul that floated away from Thaddeus was destroyed by the 4 holy light masters waiting outside with holy light. In less than 10 seconds, most of the huge mass of souls had disappeared, leaving only a burly but bloated humanoid soul. At this moment, Thaddeus' soul was a grayish-bluish purple color. Seeing this, Theon and Gavinrad frowned at the same time. There were many types of souls. Having been clerics for so long, the 2 holy knights had long known that there were very few truly holy souls and truly fallen souls. Holy light could purify evil, but it could do nothing to the souls of ordinary people. If it was so easy to have saints, then there wouldn't be so many people worshipping Alonsis Fail. Now, there was nothing the holy light could do to Thaddeus' remaining soul. At this time, it was Duque's 10 fingers that were surrounded by lightning to show their might. His lightning finger touched the floating soul. Even though it was just a light touch, it caused Thaddeus' soul to wail in pain. Duque seemed to be talking to himself. Thaddeus, leave your twisted soul alone. Even if it is temporarily purified, as long as your resentment and pain still exist in the world, you will still become an existence similar to a vengeful spirit in the near future. I don't know if doing this is salvation for you. But at least it is a way out, and there is a good chance that you can preserve your true self. Come, become my emissary of the elements, and live and die with me. Almost at the same time, Thaddeus' soul trembled violently. He was chirping cheerfully in response to Duque's call. Duque no longer hesitated and directly inserted his 10 lightning-filled fingers into Thaddeus' soul. The pain of his soul could even transcend the 5 senses of the human body and be directly perceived by the people around him, but Thaddeus was like a moth flying into a flame, taking the initiative to meet Duque's fingers. Was this a gamble of putting him on the brink of death? Or was this the last chance for redemption after falling? No one would know. The mournful screams of the soul lasted for a full 3 minutes. Finally, a translucent purple-blue soul knelt in front of Duque. Thaddeus greets Master Duque. Chapter 1264. This is a miracle? Theon had thought that he had already matured. After witnessing too many tragedies, his heart had become cold and hard. Unexpectedly, at this moment, there were still 2 streams of shameless tears that scrambled to squeeze out of his tear ducts and find a way to escape from his eyes. As a man who had fought on countless battlefields, he should not be crying, but his eyes just did not live up to his expectations. At some point, Thean noticed that Gavin Rad, who usually wore a cynical appearance, also had tear stains on his face. "Yo, Thean, you're already an uncle. Are you acting like this?" Gavin Rad complained first. Bullsh *T. You make it sound like you're not part of the 5 Silver Saints. Thean punched him, almost making Gavin Rad vomit blood. A full-powered punch from a holy knight was not an exaggeration. You might shit yourself. Of course, the one getting beaten up was also a holy light humanoid creature that could glow, so that was another story. Great. Great. Kalia was so happy that she hugged Jaina and Alicia. These 3 queens, who had been together from time to time since childhood, had their exquisite faces together. If it wasn't for the fact that Duze had already declared his ownership of them, they would definitely be praised as beautiful as a painting by now. Most of the heroines secretly wiped away their tears, and the male heroes also put down their weapons, admiring this rare scene of redemption. Duque had no time to care about the feelings of others. He still looked like a fraud, unfathomable. He stretched out his right hand, which was full of lightning, and gently stroked the head of Thaddeus' soul. Duque's voice was full of a mysterious and illusory feeling. It sounded like a morning bell ringing from a distant building on a foggy morning. It was heart-stirring. Justice may not always be rewarded. However, those who wield the sword of justice, even if they have fallen, deserve redemption. I am not a god, but I still hope to bring more hope to this world that has been ravaged by evil. Ah, Thaddeus. Answer me, how much of your soul still remembers? How much of your sanity do you still have? On Thaddeus' soul body, others could easily see the tears of the soul that flowed from his eyes. Thaddeus remembers everything, from when I became a holy knight, to when I followed Sir Uther back to Lordaeron's city, to when Uther was killed, to when I was killed, and then to when I endured the terrifying cataclysm experiment. My bewilderment, my despair, my pain. I remember all of it. When Thaddeus said this, Kalia and Gianna could not help but hold each other's hands tightly. Duque took a deep breath and said slowly, "Then, do you still hate them?" The sound wasn't loud, but it seemed to set off a sacred shockwave. Everyone could clearly see a brilliant golden light with the naked eye. With Duque as the center, it spread out in all directions like a curtain wall. I hate him. But I still remember the meaning that fate has given to my sword. Since fate has allowed Master Marcus to be haunted by the 3 virtues and the word of heaven, to redeem my soul. Then for all eternity, the sword of Thaddeus, shall be the sword of my lord, His Excellency Duke Marcus. Thaddeus bowed his head deeply. Phew. Duque exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. Fortunately, he didn't lose out this time. Otherwise, after investing so much, it would be terrible if he got a brainless fool's soul in exchange. Of course, on the surface, Duque was still full of pretense. Knight Thaddeus, please kneel. Not only Thaddeus, but everyone else also realized what this was. Benedictus seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he stopped. Thaddeus' soul had changed. Although it was still emitting a purplish-blue glow, his blurry soul body had become clear. The structure and patterns of the armor on his body could already be clearly distinguished. It was the standard armor of the Silver Hand. He knelt down on one knee excitedly, looked at Duque, and then lowered his noble head that had never been lowered to the Scourge army. Duque drew out his spiral sword, Marcus, Song of Light and Darkness, and solemnly said, "In the name of the Grand Duke of Stormwind and the World Guardian Duke Marcus, I grant you, Thaddeus, the title of Guardian Knight of the Marcus family." After saying that, the blade of the spiral sword lightly touched Thaddeus' left and right shoulders like a dragonfly skimming the water. "Thank you very much. My Lord Marcus." Thaddeus was almost in tears. For a transmigrator like Duque who had no moral integrity, the knighthood was not a big deal at all. On the other hand, this was already the most solemn knighthood ceremony in the world of Azeroth. After the dead of the Scourge army came out, the Church of Holy Light had the fiercest debate about this. It was an ideological debate. The topic of the debate revolved around whether the dead still had glory and power and status when they were alive. This debate involved the Church of Holy Light and all the feudal aristocratic ruling classes of the kingdom, and the final conclusion was that the dead could only have a false reputation and were not qualified to have any wealth or power. Because the dead could also keep the wealth they had when they were alive, then what did the descendants they left behind when they were alive eat and use? Of course, the result could only be that the living returned to the living, and the dead returned to the dead. Therefore, Duque could not make Thaddeus a knight of the kingdom. Duque took advantage of this loophole. The so-called guardian knight, to put it bluntly, was a retainer and was not protected by the kingdom's laws. The lord could do whatever he wanted. After all, the king's vassal was not the king's vassal. However, Duque was also making a huge profit. If Thaddeus' soul was not destroyed, he would definitely protect the family for generations to come. The price was just a little divinity that Duque had gotten from the Wind Prince. It seemed that the knighthood was not much different from that of an ordinary knight, but for Thaddeus, who had been tortured and a lonely soul for a long time, this was the greatest and final redemption. At some point, there was a warm applause around him, especially from the two great holy knights. They had almost broken their gauntlets from the applause. Speaking of which, to be able to complete his redemption under the witness of two first-generation holy knights, known as the 5 Silver Saints, Thaddeus was also a happy guy. He was so excited that he could only say, "Thank you." "All right, Thaddeus, your essence is now an elemental soul. I was just acting on the urgency of the matter just now. The specific adjustments will have to be done when we return to the Mage Tower. I'll take you back to the Karazhan first." Duque had no choice but to hold this guy back. "Understood. I will listen to your orders, my lord." Thaddeus replied respectfully, "Yes, there are some things. My lord, you'd better take a look." He saw the staff that Thaddeus had dug out from a pile of junk. "Huh? Sunset Tower?" Duque was pleasantly surprised. Chapter 1265. Duque was a little conflicted. Because of the skewed history, he couldn't figure out whether he was fighting a level 60 or a level 80 Naxxramas. This was because Sunset Tower was a typical item from a level 80 Naxxramas. Although Duque couldn't use it himself, the quality of this staff wasn't bad. It had powerful spell power and casting speed bonuses, plus decent endurance and spirit bonuses. It was a good staff for a priest. The design was also not bad. There were 2 sun-like golden rings at the head and tail, plus 8 small golden awls in the shape of radiation. When it was waved, it looked like it was waving 2 suns, one big and one small. Benedict didn't want this thing, so Duque might as well let Kalia take advantage of it. After Duque took control of Naxxrama's main control system, going to and from Karazhan became common. Duke took Thaddeus back for a trip. He saw Khadgar. "Oh. My dear master, what did you bring back this time? A heroic spirit? A special soul infused with the power of Logia lightning?" Although there were enough strange existences in Karazhan, there were too many of them. "I can't handle it anymore." Khadgar, the ghost mage, put his hands on his hips and kept complaining to Duque. Duque blinked, looking like he was in a difficult position. "Fine. Let's not talk about the brainless curator and the righteous saintess. Just Majordomo Executus, who was a fire demon boss, and Farina, the shadow witch, gave Khadgar a great sense of pressure. Now there was a Thunder Knight with a special soul. Khadgar felt a headache coming on. Duque sent the other elemental emissaries away and asked Khadgar, "They didn't do anything, right?" "No, the fire demon kept asking me if there were any slaves he could order around. He wanted to get you a fire elemental furnace. I gave him a small team of heroic spirit warriors to capture the monsters that came out of the spatial crack. If he can successfully enslave them, he'll give them to his new subordinates. Khadgar then rolled his eyes. Then that lady Farina, who looks like a human but is actually a shadow creature, started to ask you what kind of woman you like after I refused to let her into your bedroom. I'm so annoyed. I told you that you've recently become addicted to playing with female demons. The higher the position, the better. Slap. A certain someone slapped the back of a certain ghost mage's head with his right hand. Be careful, or I'll hit you. Duque said coldly. Bullshit. You already hit him. Karthika's eyes were seeing stars. Pa. This time, it was another slap from his left hand. Be careful, I'll hit you again. You bastard. Khadgar felt wronged. However, Karthika was the kind of person who would tear the roof tiles if he wasn't disciplined for 3 days. Duque was really afraid that he would see Farina cosplay with him later. Now that Duque had used the divinity in his hands to create 3 elemental emissaries, it was already a pain in the ass. When he had saved Thaddeus just now, he had only done it because he felt like it. Now, he realized that he had fallen into a trap. If he wanted to maintain a true elemental emissary, then that meant that Duque had to also grasp the natural element's divinity laws. Apart from the basic fire, ice, and arcane spells, there was also the wind and thunder elements and the shadow elements. In order to balance things out, he had to add the light element. If one more domain was added, the difficulty of entering the divine realm would be doubled. Right now, Duque was already at the normal difficulty multiplied by 2 to the 6th power. Duque wailed in his heart. Damn, I'm not good at math, but I know that this is 64 times. Although Duque, who had seen the ancient war, knew that an ordinary demigod with a single domain was useless, like the wild boar god, a third-rate void lord could kill it. But even 64 times, that was too difficult. And as for the direction he was working towards, Duque was still a little confused. If it was fire, ice, and arcane spells, he could still be considered a god of mages or something, but what about 6 domains? However, he would cross the bridge when he came to it. After comforting Thaddeus, Duque returned to Naxxramas and met up with the team. Because they controlled most of the strongholds, the team did not have to run and directly arrived outside the hall where the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were. Before opening the door, Duque was sensitive to the change in the atmosphere of the team. The depressing atmosphere of Thaddeus becoming a monster because of his fall, and the final redemption of his soul, filled the entire team with a relaxed atmosphere. After all, the remaining 2 groups of enemies were in a state of closing the door and beating the dogs. As an honest and reliable young man, although Duque could not do anything to kill Thuzad in the independent space, he could still trick the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. He opened a portal and then pulled in hundreds of tons of holy water from the holy city of Stratholme, all of which were poured into the ventilation pipes of the hall. The undead could not eat or breathe, just relying on the power of their souls to maintain their vitality for hundreds of years. But Duque did not believe that they could still swim in the pool of holy light. The holy water blessed by the holy light was like acid to the undead. Bathing in holy water was definitely not a pleasant experience. Although the atmosphere in the team was a little too relaxed, Duque was also very confident in his plan, so he did not intend to alarm the team members or anything. Okay, everyone, do you remember to order? Duque asked. Yes. The 14 powerhouses answered in unison. Okay. Let's go. We'll farm undead horses. Oh, no, Einherjar warhorses. Duque was too smooth with his words, saying it was undead horses. Although in the game, players took glory in farming undead horses, Duque was in the righteous camp. Before the Ebon Blade Knights turned over a new leaf and gained the recognition of mortals, undead horses were taboo. Of course, Duque had promised that he could use undead horses as raw materials. After purification, he could summon the souls of Tyrion and the others' mounts and make them into Einherjar warhorses. This idea was well received by the 2 first-generation paladins. After all, horses usually matured after the age of 4. Even if a warhorse did not die on the battlefield, it was rare to ride it until the age of 15. After 15, it was basically an old horse, unable to bear the burden. Gavin, Rad and Tyrion had fought on the battlefield for 20 years, and lost count of the number of warhorses they had changed. They also did not want to change warhorses again and again. After a long time together, there would be feelings no matter what. The two paladins did not take Duque's words to heart. After all, Duque had used his own strength to forcibly transform the shadow energy in his body into a wholly extraordinary existence. As for some of the strange habits of this great hero of the Alliance, they selectively ignored it. The huge stone door, which was a full 10 meters thick, began to open with a rumbling sound under the push of the Titan's mechanism. Just as Duque remembered, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse silently rode undead horses, standing in the middle of the hall like statues. Chapter 1266. However, Duque didn't expect that the holy water, which was supposed to reach half a person's height, had disappeared without a trace. No, it didn't disappear without a trace. A skull emitting a chilling aura had sealed all the holy water like an ice wall on the 4 sides of the wall. If it was a normal boss fight, Duque wouldn't have such a feeling. However, the instant he saw the 4 horsemen, Duque was alarmed. He wasn't the only one. Beside him, Magni had already transformed into deities to scent even without his reminder. The 2 paladins took large strides forward, tightly gripping the divine weapons in their hands. Careful, with Duque in the lead, at least 5 voices shouted out with the same mournful tone. Almost at the same time the red warning popped up on Duque's retina, the 4 horsemen completed their transformation from extreme speed to extreme speed. This felt a little ridiculous. Originally, a warhorse needed time to accelerate. One could see the warhorse bulging its thigh muscles and using the strength of its muscles to accelerate itself and the rider on top of it. However, the 4 horsemen were different. Their movements were even faster than supercars. From a standstill to a speed of 100 kilometers per hour, it took only a second. This gave most of the non-melee professions the illusion that the 4 of them were still standing on the stage in the middle, almost 100 meters away from them. Baron Rivendare quickly circled around Magni, who was attempting to block his way. Even though the Dwarf King had activated the warrior skill intercept, his large body brought about a slight decrease in agility, which was perfectly grasped by the Baron. The undead warhorse under him was like a supercar drifting, easily evading Magni's Balrog hammer and rapidly closing in on Kalia. The greatsword emitting an evil aura was prepared to pierce through her chest. Rivendare didn't feel that this was a despicable act. After all, he was charging from the front and not attacking from behind. If he didn't kill the Alliance's healer, the battle would likely drag on for a long time. The long and sharp rune greatsword easily pierced through Kalia's, holy word, shield. However, just as his blade was about to pierce through her heart, his vision suddenly blurred. Duque. At the critical moment, Duque hugged Kalia and pulled her into his arms. Not only that, spiraling sword also slashed at Rivendell. Duque's movements were so swift that he even made use of Rivendell's relative speed. The divine sword emitted a golden radiance as it accurately pierced into Rivendell's chest, emitting an intense golden light. To almost all undying beings, being struck by a divine weapon of the sacred type, even if it didn't penetrate their heads, would result in instant death due to the damage to both their soul and body. If it was an abomination-type undying existence known for its abnormal vitality and durability, it might be able to endure it. For the Death Knights, the chest where the soul fire was placed was also a fatal spot. However, not only was Rivendell not destroyed by Duque's sword, it didn't even turn its head. What flowed out from the punctured part was not blood, but an unknown object that resembled a black shadow. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse did not care and even had the time to grab and slash with their swords. Death's grasp, and cleave. Even Duque almost fell for it. Fortunately, at the critical moment, Duque conjured 2 identical illusions of Duque and Kalia and grabbed them towards Rivendell. Humph. Duque retreated again and again, at the same time casting all 18 Magus hands simultaneously. In the next second, 18 instant cast, flame blast, blasted over. Even with the undead warhorse, Death Knights were never known for their speed. Duque's Flame Blast fireballs were already very fast. With Rivendel's speed, it was impossible for him to evade them. The torrential torrent of pyroblast fireballs shot out at a speed that far exceeded his ability to dodge. Yet, Rivendell was actually able to disperse the fireballs with his left hand. It was as unimaginable as a mortal catching a flying bullet with his bare hands. Of course, the Death Knight also paid the price. Every muscle on his left hand was torn, and his gauntlets were also broken. His bones were also shattered and scattered. However, even though he was a Death Knight, due to his innate ability, his regenerative abilities were much faster than his injuries. Not only the injury on his arm, but the fact that the gauntlets were instantly repaired caused Duque's hair to stand on end. However, Duque was very clear that Rivendell definitely did not suck any blood. What the hell is this? On the other side, Lord Kurtaz and Jaina were clashing. Duque's eyeballs almost popped out of their sockets. What did he just see? Jaina was clearly a Breaking Dawn mage. In the domain of magic, there were only a handful of people who could match up to her. However, Lord Kurtaz's super meteor fireball was suppressing Jaina. This was not a geographical factor. Naxxramas did not reject the molten core of the frost elemental. Here, except for the shadow elemental, the other elements had equal opportunities to be used. Now it was Kurtaz, the dwarven Death Knight, who was bullying Jaina with a higher purity and greater amount of fire elemental. The gap was so big that it almost made Jaina despair. If it was not for Alucia helping her and Gavinrad fiercely using the wind sword to cut down Kurtaz's melee attacks, Jaina would have probably been defeated in 2 moves. On the other side, Tyrion was also having a headache. He was facing Sir Zeliek. Whether Tyrion was willing to admit it or not, he had now finally seen for himself what it meant for the undead to play with the holy light. It was very ironic. His soul should have fallen, but because of some kind of purity in his heart, he still obtained the recognition of the holy light. Zeliek attacked Tyrion with Divine Wrath and Holy Arrow. It looked like a civil war between paladins, very ridiculous. Finally, there was Duchess Blomu. Her skill was the most insidious of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Unknowingly, her feet would fall into the evil nether domain. If you were not careful for even a second, you would not even know when the shadow domain under your feet turned into a black sludge. By the time you reacted, you would often be swallowed by the dark void. Vanessa almost fell for it. If she did not have Shadow Cloak, and forcibly used magic immunity to save her life for a short period of time, she would probably be lying on the ground. However, the most terrifying thing was not the single attack of the 4 horsemen, but when the 4 of them stood together, there would be 4 terrible halo effects that would constantly superimpose curses on the entire alliance of heroes. Separate them. Duque shouted at the top of his voice. Chapter 1267. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse had to fight separately. This was common knowledge to every Warcraft player who had fought Naxxramas. It was a tactic that had to be carried out. After the 4 horsemen split up, any one of them could only be considered second-rate powerhouses. With the 4 horsemen together, they would be a top-tier combination that would give anyone a headache. Before Duque had transmigrated, it was because he had led his team to destroy the 4 horsemen and clear Naxxramas that he had become a famous team leader in the entire server and even the 4 servers. Moreover, the 4 horsemen in front of him were definitely not normal. Individually, they were extremely powerful, not to mention when the 4 halo-like curses were stacked together. Every horseman's mark was a layer of additional damage imposed on the Alliance powerhouses. It was not obvious at first. The mark stacked once every 12 seconds. Once 4 layers were stacked, it would be 4 times the damage. At this time, they would basically be insta-killed. 5 layers of marks meant death. On the other hand, as long as they exceeded 60 yards, the effects of the halos would disappear after 12 seconds. Therefore, the 4 horsemen had to be split up. The entire team rotated like a wheel, taking turns to attack each horseman. Normally, separating the enemies shouldn't be a problem. But imagination was one thing, and reality was another. It was unknown if someone had instructed them, or if they had thought of it themselves, but the 4 death knights on their undead warhorses moved about in a daze, constantly dodging Magni's charge and the other 3 paladins' attacks. They rejected any competition of strength and kept the entire alliance's hero group within the effective range of the 4 marks. At first, Magni and the others didn't think that the marks Duque spoke of were so terrifying. But when the 4 marks stacked to the 3rd layer, Jaina was the first to fall. Lord Kurtaz, meteor, smashed down with a loud bang, and the terrifying destructive power was already 4 times stronger. This wasn't something a newly advanced Breaking Dawn Great Wizard could withstand. The clash between the ice tornado and the fire meteor ended with the frost elemental's complete defeat. If Jaina hadn't used the top-grade equipment left behind by Duque to activate a talisman that temporarily increased magic damage and risked the damage to the magic circuit in her body to throw a second ice tornado to forcefully offset the aftermath of the fire meteor, perhaps Alicia and Sasha in Jaina's team would have been defeated. The other groups were also in danger. Because the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse could not be pulled apart, they had no choice but to stack more cursed halos. Boss, no. Gavin Rad was the first to shout. I'm fine, but the others are dead. Magni, who was almost immune to magic, was also panicking. Is there a plan B? Even someone as cautious and calm as Theon couldn't sit still. Do you think you can have a plan B just because you say so? As expected, reality and the game were 2 different things. The mark of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, even if it was a group of heroes with top-quality equipment and a few paladins with 1 chance of invincibility, couldn't be stacked 6 times. The hesitation and panic of the Alliance experts fell into the eyes of Baron Rivendare, a true fallen who willingly became a Death Knight. Rivendell, who had been silent since the start of the battle, finally spoke. His voice was filled with malevolence. Feeling uneasy? Was he afraid? It was too late. The living. Only eternal death is the end of all things. None of you can escape the fate of death. Come, join us. Under the command of the great Lich King, Arthas, we shall establish an eternal kingdom on this land. His tone was filled with the smell of a charlatan. And a fart. Following Rivendell's words, the solid tiles on the ground trembled slightly. Every expert of the Alliance reflexively looked down at their feet. In an instant, at least 10 slender shadow spears were summoned on almost every square meter of the ground. Like a primordial forest rising from the ground, the razor-sharp shadow spears stabbed at every Alliance expert. If they didn't do anything, the spears would pierce through their bodies one by one, turning them into human flesh sashimi. If they were ordinary professionals, they would probably be annihilated in an instant. Consecration. Without even a tenth of a second of hesitation, the 3 paladins activated their skills. They infused holy energy into the ground and countered Rivendell's ultimate skill. However, it was unknown if it was the effect of the mark or something else. Obviously, the range of the paladins, consecration, could only protect their party members within 25 yards. Any further and it would be useless. Riadeline's strength was slightly weaker. Her holy energy could only protect a mere 10 yards. Anyone who wanted to leave the range of the paladin's protection would have to face the terrifying shadow skill alone unless they could fly. Seeing that his skill didn't kill any Alliance expert, Rivendell wasn't annoyed. He had already achieved his goal of delaying the enemy. If Duque was still the newly arrived transmigrator, perhaps he would really kneel down and lick the fool's boots. Speaking of his glorious past, Duque was someone who had slept with a queen, tamed a female dragon, and had a harem in every Alliance country. How could he abandon the benefits of swordsmanship to become a rotten Death Knight? What kind of joke was that? The leader was enraged. Oh. No, it was Duque who was enraged. It doesn't matter what Kel Thuzad enhanced you with. You want to take care of us? You bullsh *T horsemen of the apocalypse aren't qualified. As if responding to Duque's roar, both sides in the hall felt the ground tremble. Without giving any time to react, the floor that seemed to remain unchanged for 10,000 years collapsed. "Save me, I'm going to fall to my death." Having lost his footing, Magni was so scared that he almost peed his pants. After falling 100 meters, he suddenly realized that the top of his head was filled with flames. 1, 2, 10, they were all pure-blooded firehawks with beautiful flames lingering around them. F***CK. I actually forgot about it. I'm also an awesome person with a flying mount. Although his reaction in the hero party was slow, he wasn't an idiot. Magni roared, "Come out, my rock." A small firebird immediately jumped out from Magni's wrist, and in less than a tenth of a second, it grew into a huge firebird with a wingspan of more than 8 meters. It nimbly flew to his rapidly falling body, and caught him in his arms. 3 seconds later, the Alliance's powerhouses all flew to Magni's side, who was still in shock. "Ha ha ha. I can't take it anymore. I will definitely tell Kudrin about how you almost peed your pants and let him mock you for the rest of his life." Having just escaped from death, Gavin Rad's mouth was cheap again. Chapter 1268. Gavin Rad only said a few words. Next, everyone looked at Duque again. The other party is obviously not in line with the intelligence. "What should we do next?" Jaina asked. Duque's eyes narrowed into a line, and he could not help but think to himself. Sure enough, there was no boss in this world waiting to be slaughtered. The situation in front of them was indeed a variable, but a good variable. As long as the team was not wiped out, then the variable also meant challenges and surprises. Although this surprise almost turned into shock and fear, no matter how Kel Thuzad thought, he would never have thought that I had such a trick up my sleeve. Phew. Duque let out a long sigh of relief. With a snap of his fingers, the dark space below suddenly lit up, and he said loudly, "Do you see the situation below?" Everyone looked and immediately sighed in their hearts. This was the advantage of turning the enemy into one's own home ground. The floor, which looked extremely sturdy just now, collapsed and fell to the ground. In the unknown lower level of Naxxramas, the huge square space was divided into 4 small squares of equal size. Between each square space, there was a wall nearly 10 meters thick that was reinforced by Titan runes, and it was impossible to connect to each other. Except for one square space that was completely shrouded in black mist, in the other 2 spaces, Lord Kurtaz, Sir Zeliek, and Duchess Blumwa could clearly be seen. Their respective radiances were very easy to recognize. Kurtaz has someone to deal with. "Let's focus on the other 3 horsemen of the apocalypse," Duque ordered. "This mechanism is amazing." Although she did not have much contact with Duque, Riadeline only had admiration for this alliance commander who had taken away her queen. But thinking about it, since Duque could control Farina and make most of the death knights and abominations fall into the temple of Ankh-Kiraj to become food for the insects, then he could naturally control the mechanism of the fortress and forcibly break up the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Tyron's eyes were full of curiosity. "Duque, did you think of this a long time ago? Or did you improvise?" Duque's face was a little gloomy. "I was going to train the team." On the other hand, the Death Knights and their undead warhorses couldn't fly, but Death's Grasp was indeed useful. If it were any other profession that did not have life-saving skills such as slow fall, they would definitely fall into meat paste. However, the horseman of the apocalypse used Death's Grasp to grab onto the protrusions on the walls around him when he fell and descended safely step by step. Lord Kurtaz rode the undead warhorse under him and landed lightly in the huge square space that was at least 200 meters long and wide. He had no choice but to descend because he saw the pureblood fire eagles that the Alliance experts were riding on. In a situation where the enemy had an air force, if he stayed on the wall without any cover, he would be a target. But he was really surprised as the Alliance experts actually split into 3 and flew towards his friends. He had a bad feeling. His surroundings were pitch black, and a strange fog obscured most of his senses. However, he instinctively sensed the location of his other 3 companions and wanted to approach them. In theory, as long as he was close enough, his mark of Kurtaz, could still affect the Alliance experts. He even tried to see if he could use meteor to cross the wall to deal damage to the enemy. Just as he was urging his horse forward, there was suddenly a shrill sound of wind breaking in the darkness. He was one with the undead warhorse, and it wasn't too easy for him to dodge this attack that was like a collapsing mountain. The undead did not feel pain, and when the attack came down, the rubble splashed out and hit her and the undead warhorse. This made him extremely afraid of the enemy. This was definitely not a human or a dwarf who had descended from the heavens. This was, "Yo! Where are you in such a hurry to go, little skeleton? Aren't you going to play with me?" Accompanied by a slightly evil female voice, two glistening yellow lights appeared in the darkness. No. These weren't lights. They were actually the eyeballs of two huge dragons. Kurtaz could easily recognize those iconic vertical pupils even if he had used up dust. Onyxia. The dark clouds retreated a little, and the iconic black dragon scales of the Black Dragon Princess, as well as her huge head with huge horns and many spikes, also appeared in the darkness. At this moment, Kurtaz felt as if he had been attacked by a dog. How could he make the opponent send the dignified Black Dragon Princess to deal with him? Unwilling to be captured without a fight, Kurtaz raised his hand and used meteor. This fire elemental attack was like a meteor piercing through the atmosphere, and with a rumbling sound, it exploded on top of Onyxia's head. Faced with such an attack, the Black Dragon Princess did not even have the mood to use her dragon scales to block it. Whoosh! She blew out a breath. Right. Just AF** king blow, not even a deep breath or dragon breath, and Kurtaz, meteor, was completely blown away. It suddenly deviated from its intended trajectory and exploded 30 meters away. The huge black dragon's face was full of ridicule. "You want to use fire to deal with me? Hee, wait until you have the strength of Ragnaros first." Low-level mysteries were destined to be crushed by high-level mysteries. It was true that Kurtaz was a Death Knight who could play with fire and meteors, but unfortunately, he was only a Death Knight who had been specially modified. Even with the special bonuses, the flames he produced were only at the level of Breaking Dawn. He was destined to be miserable against the demigod Onyxia who grew up playing with fire. Seeing Kurtaz's dead face and constipated expression, Onyxia was amused. If it wasn't for her hateful master forcing her to fight against a strong enemy, she wouldn't want to do it. On the contrary, she loved bullying noobs the most. "Come on. Let's play. How about I let you use one of my claws?" The evil Black Dragon Princess seemed to be fair, but this was like inviting a guest to a farmhouse on a hot day, and saying that there was a freshly burned pit, so it's hot. It was completely a scam. The opponent's best attack was useless, but Kurtaz didn't know any other elemental magic apart from fire, and then let a small Death Knight play hand-to-hand combat with an ancient demigod dragon. And this guy wasn't called Arl Fool. That was really ha ha ha. Ah. The entire space echoed with Lord Kurtaz's miserable screams. On the other side, in the 3 square fields, the remaining horsemen of the apocalypse welcomed the Alliance powerhouses. Every time, 5 powerhouses jumped out of the portal that suddenly opened and quickly attacked the horsemen of the apocalypse. Then, without waiting for the horseman's mark to stack, they immediately jumped away through the portal that suddenly appeared. Chapter 1269. Separated from their companions, surrounded by a group of strange enemies in a strange place, and less than 20 seconds after falling, the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse could not help but feel their hearts tighten. Lord Kurtaz was in trouble. They did not know what enemy he had encountered, but it was obvious that it was a terrifying enemy that he could not contend against because the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse sensed that Kurtaz had already activated Death's Rampart. Death's Rampart was a skill that Kel Thuzad had specially bestowed upon them after Naxxramas fell. It turned out that this skill was similar to the warrior's shield wall, which could greatly reduce damage from the outside world. After Kel Thuzad's modification, this skill used highly concentrated shadow power stored in a soul gem to forcefully create a barrier to resist attacks from the outside world. If the group of Alliance powerhouses in front of them all focused fire, they could resist for at least 20 seconds. However, with the Alliance powerhouses taking turns to appear, it was impossible for Duque's group to have the spare time to deal with Kurtaz. Then who was it? Of course, the Horsemen of the Apocalypse did not know that Duque had shamelessly let the boss, Onyxia, in as well. Yo! Little Bone Shorty, don't die so quickly. Play with me again. With a teasing voice, Onyxia swept her dragon tail over. The Death Knights were one with their horses, and their movements were agile, but that was only for Alliance powerhouses without mounts. They could not fly, and it was even more impossible for them to jump into the air, do 9 backflips, and then stand steadily on the ground like rangers or thieves. Facing a dragon tail or dragon wings that were more than 15 meters long, Kurtaz was in a difficult situation. How terrifying was the dragon's combat instincts. When the dragon tail was swung around, it was like a large battering ram. But Onyxia's dragon tail was much more terrifying than a siege hammer. Not only did it have a longer effective range, but it also had long and incomparably hard bone spurs. It was not a siege hammer at all, but a meteor hammer used by gods. With a swing of her tail, it was simply earth-shattering. It was impossible to dodge, so the bitter Death Knight could only take it head-on. Who knew that Onyxia was also a thief? Her first attack seemed to be a sweep of her dragon tail, but in the end, a dragon claw slapped down from the opposite direction, directly breaking the undead warhorse's limbs. Hearing the cracking sound of the undead warhorse's leg bone, Lord Kurtaz's heart broke. Ah! Lord Kurtaz took out a battle axe from his portal bag and slashed at the dragon's claw, but the dragon's tail arrived again. Hi! Watch my black dragon home run, Onyxia smirked and sent Kurtaz flying with a swipe of her tail. Kurtaz was a dwarf paladin when he was alive, and after he died, he was just a dwarf that needed to be killed. As a result, he was directly smashed into the steep and solid wall by the dragon race's tremendous strength. The huge impact almost made him fall apart on the spot. He slid down the wall, but before he hit the ground, the huge dragon wings had already smacked him. The impact, which was enough to shatter an ordinary professional into pieces on the spot and measured in tons, instantly slammed half of his body into the wall. Yo! Could it be that after slapping the wall, you can't even pull it out? Onyxia grinned sinisterly. Although she had already obediently become Duque's mount, as a black dragon who came from the evil faction and had a bad heart, she had accumulated a lot of pressure, and now was a good time for her to vent. Shaking her head, the black dragon princess said, it seems that I've also been taught badly by that damn master. Why is my mouth full of his lines? Kurtaz struggled. I swear allegiance to the great Lich King. Wah! Before the miserable horseman of the apocalypse could finish speaking, he was smacked by a dragon's tail, and he was directly smacked into the death barrier state. Bullsh *T. You actually want such a beautiful me to be an ugly bone dragon? Bone Shorty, congratulations, you've angered me. Onyxia showed off her female might. She did not know that according to history, she would later really be resurrected by her father as an ugly undead dragon. However, the throbbing of fate was like a magical sixth sense that constantly tugged at her heartstrings, telling her that only Duque could escape this nightmarish fate. She couldn't help but attack even more fiercely. When Onyxia went to bully the noobs, Duque finally formed the attack cycle of his dreams. The 15 heroes split into 3 attack groups, and attacked the remaining 3 horsemen in a wave formation. Duque followed Magni, Riadeline, Sylvanas, and Vanessa. Duque. Are you here to obstruct the great cause of our master again? Why can't you see through it? Only death is eternal, Rivendell roared, attempting to use his signature greatsword to slash at Duque. Duque was annoyed by this brainwashing roar, and immediately retorted, Bullsh *T, what's so good about the undead tribe? If you have the ability, ask Arthas to nurture a low-level skeleton soldier into a death knight. How dare you ask your grandfather to join a race that has no future? Ignoring Queen Sylvie's laughter, Duque continued to complain in his mind. This isn't a game, where you can train a puny level 1 Forsaken to level 110 like a player. Bones could be leveled up, but that didn't hold true in the world of Azeroth. One's aptitude in life determined one's potential in death. If one was trash in life, they could only be cannon fodder in death. Therefore, to a Lich King fanatic like Rivendell, Duque only had one thing to say to him. You'd better die early, don't obstruct the planet's rotation. Unfortunately, as long as Duque didn't break into the realm of divinity, he wouldn't be immune to Rivendell's mark. After stacking up 4 layers, Duque led his party away. Of course, in the original version, the simplest strategy against the 4 horsemen was to have 4 tanks tank the boss while 1 tank took over. However, Duque cheated by splitting the 4 horsemen into 4 separate spaces. He even used a teleportation door as a means of movement, thus simplifying the strategy. Don't run. Seeing that Duque and the rest were trying to escape, Rivendell naturally gave chase. However, chasing didn't mean that he could catch up. Magni slammed his hammer on the floor, and the shattered tiles emitted the distinct power of thunder. The intense arcs of electricity forced Rivendell to slow down. A heroic warrior was this simple and violent when he acted shamelessly. Not only that, there was also Duque's decelerate. The two of them made Rivendell's movements as slow as a snail. By the time he regained his mobility, the 5 fleeing fellows had already jumped into the teleportation door and disappeared. Almost at the same time, less than 40 yards behind him, the 5 fellows jumped out from another teleportation door. Taking turns? Chapter 1270. Come, come, come. Fight it out with your grandpa Gavin Rad. A guy named Paladin, or Rogue, brandished a huge divine artifact longsword, surging with the power of wind and thunder as he charged over. For a moment, Rivendell didn't want to waste his time with these guys. Because the final result of a continuous battle would definitely be the destruction of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Unfortunately, he had to fight even if he didn't want to. Thunder's Fury, blessed sword of the Wind Seeker, was not a simple melee weapon. With a swing of the huge sword, Rivendell felt as if the air around him had been pushed away. Even the undead warhorse under him seemed to have been sucked into a black hole. His body became sluggish, and even the powerful undead warhorse could not move for a second. At this time, a new 5-man squad had already closed in on him at high speed and engaged him in a fierce battle. Damn it! Rivendell cursed. Who is he? Who is she? Both of them are so strong. It wasn't that Rivendell didn't do his homework and couldn't tell who the experts of the Alliance were, but he didn't have the luxury to do so. The palpitations in his soul made him panic. He could clearly feel that the distance between him and the other 3 horsemen of the apocalypse was constantly widening. At the same time, his strength was rapidly weakening. Has the secret finally been discovered? Unfortunately, Gavinrad's wind sword, Aurelia's wind and thunder arrows, Vanessa's deadly twin daggers, Jaina's large fireball, and Benedictus's holy light punishment all rained down on him, making him unable to take care of himself. Oh, no, he didn't even know how many bones he had broken. At this time, Duque's squad had already run through the portal to beat up Duchess Blomu. If one were to say who was the most difficult to deal with among the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the first would definitely be that damn dwarf Kurtaz. That level of fire magic, if it carried more than 4 layers of imprints, not to mention Jaina, even Duque would feel weak. The vicious curse imprint could directly reduce the opponent's magic resistance. If it were a mage, it would reduce the magic output of the magic circuit. The second most difficult to deal with was Baron Rivendell. The remaining 2, on the other hand, only had a single attack method and none of them were capable of killing in an instant. They were practically playing around. So when Riadaline injected holy light into the ground so that the team could surround and beat Blomu, Queen Sheena suddenly asked, "What is going on with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? I feel that they are too weak." Weak? Of course. Do you know that they're already over 3,000 yards away from each other? 3,000 yards? It didn't seem like much, and he didn't count it when he had a flying mount, but this distance was indeed not short. Queen Sylvanas was smart. She immediately thought of something. Their strength is inversely proportional to the distance between them? The greater the distance, the weaker they are. Yes. Because they have a stingy boss. Before Duque could finish, Blamu had already slashed down with a rune sword. You are not allowed to insult Sir Kel Thuzad. Poor guy, he's been brainwashed. If you were freed from the Lich King's mental control, would you still say that? As Duque complained, he swung his hand and a high elemental fireball smashed into the horseman's face, directly sending her flying. This time, Duque was right. The four horsemen of the apocalypse suddenly strengthened for a reason. After fighting for so long, the system elf had also analyzed for so long, and the final conclusion made Duque feel a slight pain in the ass. Kel Thuzad had injected divinity into all four of them. Of course, it was not some high-purity good stuff. It was unknown whether this divinity was obtained from Northrend or plundered from other places. It had characteristics similar to Zul Amon's animal evil god, crazy and full of a sense of chaos. If this power had to be described as similar, then Duque would definitely think that the closest answer was the blood of an abyss lord. It could indeed greatly increase the strength and destructive power of the user. Replacing it was the gradual loss of rationality, falling into madness and killing, unable to extricate themselves. Using this on the calm, cruel, and powerful Death Knights, Kel was at his wit's end. Moreover, this thing was not just one portion, but an extremely powerful chaos divinity that was forcibly divided into four parts. The consequence of being divided into four, in addition to each having different characteristics, also triggered a perception similar to that of twins. However, too far away would cause the divinity to weaken, which was something Kel Thuzad did not expect. So on the surface, Kel Thuzad threw out the names of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, such as war, massacre, hunger, and death. In fact, this was to cover up the failure of this experiment. Of course, it was impossible for others to discover this small difference. Duque had the system monitoring the data of the four horsemen from beginning to end. When the system had an answer, it just so happened that the team was in danger, so Duque decisively tore down the hall where the four horsemen of the apocalypse were and forcibly broke them up. Now Duque frowned. What's wrong? Kel almost found a chance to escape. Indeed, after eating fire, wind, and shadow divinity in one go, Duque was already a one-star Breaking Dawn Archmage just based on the total amount of magic power. But Duque's current combat power was only around 2-star. After all, apart from the fire divinity, Duque did not dare to use the other two. The core of his power was the mage. Before the foundation of the mage was stable, abusing the divinity of other elements was likely to break the balance of the magic circuit in his body. That was really courting death. In a situation where the divinity was unbalanced, Duque could use at most 70% of his strength. Under this premise, he had to take into account the control of Naxxramas, ensure the blockade of the space where Kel Thuzad was, and open the portal to teleport the three squads. At this moment, Duque's individual combat power was only half a notch higher than Jaina's. Just now, Duque was ruthless and rewarded Blamu with a big fireball, and Kel almost found a chance to break through. There was no other way. Before dealing with the four horsemen of the apocalypse, Duque could only be a good baby. As the battle went on, the Alliance powerhouses all felt the weakness of the horsemen of the apocalypse. Even though they had activated Death Rampart, which absorbed almost all damage 3 times, the sluggishness of their movements, the decline in the power of their attacks, and the disorder of the elemental attacks they released could not be hidden from the experienced Alliance hero squad. When Death Rampart was activated for the 3rd time, Duque looked up to the sky and shouted, "Onyxia, stop playing." Silence rippled in the air, and then 3 seconds passed. Suddenly, a special portal opened in the void. Unlike the bluish-purple arcane portal that Duque often used, this portal was made of flames and was quite large. It looked like the main entrance of the Storm Fortress. Countess Katrana, who exuded sexiness and swaying charm, had a snow-white left arm on her waist, but her right hand was holding a huge head that exuded a flame aura. Chapter 1271. Following that, the Countess flung her arm. The scorched skull, still shrouded in flame elements, drew a perfect arc in the air and landed beside Baron Rivendare's feet. Kurtaz? Even though his face was beyond recognition, even though his soul sensed his broken chains, Rivendare's movements turned sluggish at the sight of his comrade's demise. Disregarding his divinity, he knew his own capabilities. If not for his master reviving him out of loyalty, he would still be a vengeful spirit by the sun well, or perhaps he would have been annihilated by the holy light. Unfortunately, it was impossible for him to reverse this defeat. No, he roared, and launched a suicidal charge at Magni, who had descended from the heavens. Humph. Magni was rather displeased. He had already noticed that Rivendare's scarlet soul pupils weren't looking at him, but Duque. He didn't roar. Instead, Magni remained strangely silent. His left hand that was holding the axe first smashed out with a hammer. That's right. It was a hammer. Galestorm's hammer, formed from lightning. If it was in the past, Rivendare would have used his astounding horsemanship to maneuver his undead warhorse to nimbly dodge. But now, he couldn't care less. If this dragged on, his end would still be destruction. Might as well give it a shot. Intense lightning bolts exploded on the undead warhorse. Violent lightning snakes wriggled around the undead warhorse. Even though the undead warhorse was a spirit, it couldn't help but twitch under such a powerful elemental attack. However, Rivendare's body had already entered a jumping/state. His posture was as perfect as Gromhel's scream. You want to go over? Have you asked for my permission? At this moment, Magni's right arm abruptly swung. His speed was fast and his strength was ferocious. It was as though Magni was swinging a gigantic plate. Yes, a plate made entirely out of flames. Hand of Savras, Balrog Ragnaros, had unleashed its might. The divine warhammer transformed into a waterfall of flames as it smashed towards Rivendare. Die, Duque! Rivendare bellowed malevolently as though he didn't see the gigantic flaming warhammer crashing towards his lower body. Bang! Sparks flew in all directions. The leader of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, Rivendell, had half of his body turned into charcoal, disappearing into the wind. Who would have thought that when the warhammer swung down, Rivendell's sword-wielding upper body actually maintained its original trajectory and continued pouncing towards Duque? Vanessa was the first to notice something was wrong. She immediately threw a dozen flying daggers. Queen Sylvan's thunderbolt bolt struck Rivendell's chest accurately at the crimson soulfire. Then, it was Riadeline's hammer of wrath, which was infused with the will of the Holy Knight Destroyer. The golden holy light hammer directly smashed onto the back of the Death Knight, and the sound of bones breaking could be heard. But Rivendell was still desperate. At this moment, everyone finally realized that Rivendell had abandoned all defenses and relied solely on his body to withstand the attacks. It was all for the sake of perishing together with Duque. Pfft! Vanessa suddenly burst out laughing without a care in the world. A mere horseman of the apocalypse with low HP wanted to fight to the death with her immoral and beastly Duke Master who kept all his life-saving skills? Was the Death Knight's brain damaged? When Vanessa turned to look at Duque, she was shocked to see Duque not evading. Instead, he wielded his staff in his left hand and his sword in his right as he strode forward. Damn it! Is my master addicted to being a swordsman? Swordsman? Perhaps. Humans are despicable. Humans are despicable. Humans are despicable. The feeling of being one with the despicable wasn't bad at all. If he could defeat the boss, he would never allow it to reach its peak. This was Duque's maxim. But sometimes, Duque would let his emotions get the better of him. For example, now. In terms of emotions, he could tolerate those who were afraid of death and willingly become the Lich King's servant in order to obtain eternal life. However, he absolutely disliked those who sold out their teammates, their master, and even their own subjects for the sake of their so-called immortality, turning them into undead. This was what Duque told himself. I will destroy him completely. Duque struck. It was an ordinary stab that even a 3-month-old militia could execute. The strange spiral-shaped, screw-like longsword pierced Rivendell's head. It was as though Rivendell was sending himself to his death. Duque's sword pierced through the pale face of the nobleman who kept spitting out crazily. Like a watermelon, the dried brain matter and shrunken brain matter splattered all over the ground. But not a single drop or piece of rotten flesh could penetrate Duque's ice barrier and stain Duque's blue and white magician robes. Amateurs enjoyed the show, while experts observed the artistry. Riadeline and Magni could only sense that something was amiss. Only Vanessa and Queen Sylvanas sensed that Duque seemed to have vanished in that instant. It wasn't a physical disappearance. Duque could still be sensed, seen, heard, and smelled. But it was as though Duque had vanished for a split second. This is a little technique in using the soul. This was a skill that Duque had learned when he was a Void Lord. The Undying had no 5 senses towards the outside world. Because of death, the 5 senses of the living would no longer transmit any response. The only thing they could rely on was their soul. Everything in the world had a soul. Even a rock that mortals thought was lifeless actually contained large amounts of bacteria and microorganisms. These organisms formed the body of a soul, and the soul undulations they emitted could still be sensed by the Undying. Thus, in the world of the Undying, only the color of the soul remained. What Duque did was to block the dissipation of his soul in that instant. Thus, in the perception of mortals, Duque didn't do anything. In fact, Duque had already vanished from Rivendell's sight for a while. In the end, Rivendell foolishly delivered his head to the rapidly thrusting spiraling rapier's blade. Ah, that was the final scream of Rivendell's soul. It intensely stimulated the eardrums and souls of the spectators. Has Rivendell's soul been completely destroyed this time? Queen Sylvie asked. She still remembered that she had killed Rivendell once on the Isle of Quel's Donnas. Basically. Queen Sylvanas was curious. Sigh. Duque sighed. The scourge are the most troublesome. I can indeed destroy their souls with holy light. If their souls aren't complete before I destroy them, such as preserving or hiding a portion, they can still rely on the remaining souls to resurrect. Chapter 1272. Rivendell tortured and murdered the interracial newlyweds, granting them death and a pitiful life of servitude. However, at this time, Kel Thuzad played a beautiful diversion. He first let Naxxramas fly to Lordaeron. In fact, when the fortress flew over the hinterlands, he secretly dropped an elite group of Death Knights led by Rivendell. The most important fulcrum of this supply line was the strong fortress built in the southwest corner of Stratholme, the Northern Fortress. The predecessor of the Northern Fortress was the Northern Sentry Tower. Later, under the orders of Duque, the Alliance gathered a considerable amount of manpower and material resources to expand this sentry tower, forming a small fortress covering an area of 3,000 square meters with 5 towers in the east, west, south, north, and center. The portal opened. Tyrion carried Zeliek's head and Gavin Rad dragged the soulless remains of Blomel. The 15 members of the hero group finally gathered. The higher-ups of the Alliance ordered to shrink the line of defense. Unfortunately, the rebuilding of the Blood Elf Kingdom of Sin Dorii was equally shocking. It's all settled, Gavin Rad gasped softly. In fact, this was also a sin committed by Kel Thuzad and Naxxramas a while ago. Duque sighed softly. In order to coordinate how to better protect the continuous flow of strategic supplies to the Kingdom of Sin Dorii, the two commanders constantly met in an abandoned village in the North Valley. As a result, the handsome Sir Zeliek fell in love with Miss Blomel. Similarly, the beautiful Miss Blomel was conquered by Sir Zeliek's charming temperament. The busybodies held a grand wedding for the two. People temporarily forgot about the terrible natural disaster, and a warm atmosphere reappeared in this sad land. The land of Lordaeron, which had been polluted by the plague of the natural disaster, showed signs of recovery. Tyrion was a very upright person, and he also had something to say. When they stood opposite us as Death Knights, we should undoubtedly destroy them, but now, the representatives were Duchess Blaumeux of Sin Dorii and Sir Zeliek of Lordaeron. The former served as the commander of the Salis Sentry Tower, while the latter served as the commander of the Northern Sentry Tower. Both of them were the core figures of the Scourge Defense Force. In fact, Duque's willpower wasn't that strong, but Duque's soul was very tolerant. Most of them were the souls, moral integrity, of the famous saints, which was why the people called him Saint Duque. If the three of them did not mention it, Duque would not know anything about the background of these two horsemen of the apocalypse. From the moment he met Kill Jaden, he was afraid of everything and didn't dare to take responsibility. That was why Ghoul Dan was promoted. After that, he became the great chieftain, and because he was afraid of Kill Jaden, he risked his life to attack Azeroth. In the end, he was directly blown up by Duque. Duque's scalp went numb. All right. Let me try. That was how the second Lich King, Arthas, came into being. If he had put in some effort, there would have only been one Lich King, Zul. If he didn't get tortured by Kill Jaden's soul for 8 to 10 years, he wouldn't be able to do anything. He lost himself a long time ago. If it's a soul fusion, it will inevitably introduce the will of other souls. Even if it's a fusion with a blank baby's soul, it will dilute the concentration of the original soul. The strength of the soul affects a person's strength. If the fused soul is too weak, the strength will be greatly reduced. If the fused soul is too strong, he will lose himself, or he won't even know which will belongs to him. It sounded like there was no end to this. The beautiful and dignified female elf was the first to speak. Her voice, which was like an oriole coming out of the valley, had a rare solemnity. Actually, Blaumeux and Zeliek are from the Silver Dawn. Because of Arthas' destruction of Lordaeron City and the Silvermoon City massacre, many survivors were in extreme pain and also extremely hostile to the Scourge. Duque smiled bitterly. Generally speaking, an independent soul is very exclusive. Basically, there is no real fusion between souls. It's like water and oil, never mixing together. But the Scourge seems to have some kind of method to forcibly stitch different souls together. For example, when we first discovered that Kel Thuzad was a necromancer, we used holy light to purify his soul. It stands to reason that at least 80% of his soul should be gone. As a last resort, after some discussion, Kalia and Sylvanas decided to maintain the supply line from Stratholme to Long Song Forest. Kalia said, "Can we redeem their souls like we did with Thaddeus?" Duque deliberated for a moment and continued, "It's very difficult for the soul of a living creature to multiply. You can think of it this way. The lost soul can never be recovered. It will disappear forever, along with some memories." In fact, there was another example, the Lich King Zul and Arthas. On the surface, it was Zul who had been tempting the fool to fall, dragging his soul into the abyss of despair. Unfortunately, Zul was too soft. Queen Sylvanas' question felt like she was asking Duque his own question. From the beginning to the end, this guy was a guy who was afraid of death. Then why? Queen Sylvanas wanted to say something but stopped. While Duque's team was in a daze, the battle on the other two sides had also come to an end. They only needed to change their target once more before they were done. At the start of the battle, I could feel the struggle of their souls, Tyrion said. Then what's going on with the other souls? You know what happened next. When Aurelia said this, she could not help but feel sad. Resurrection. This word made Queen Sylvanas very unhappy. After hearing this, Duque was at first stunned. As a transmigrator and veteran player, unless it was a game mission that left a deep impression, no one would care about the historical background of each boss in a large dungeon with more than a dozen bosses. Seeing that they were hesitant to speak, Duque could only say, "What's wrong?" After listening to Tyrion's detailed explanation, Duque learned, Duque. Kalia crossed her fingers and made a standard prayer gesture. "Me too," Gavin Rad said. Now, he had tempted Arthas to fuse with his soul, but who knew that his will was too weak? The result was that the great chief and first-generation Lich King's will was almost swallowed up without a trace left. The other fulcrum of the supply line was the Salas sentry tower at the border between Lordaeron and Sin Dorii. This sentry tower was guarded by an independent force that did not belong to either country, Silver Dawn. The problem was that President Ku drove the flying fortress everywhere to cause trouble, and the greatly strengthened main cities of the alliance were not a big problem. However, due to the lack of mobility and low visibility at night, there were always remote areas affected. At this time, Aurelia, Tyrion and Kalia came together. Chapter 1273. Divinity itself was not something that could be found on the street. Suitable divinity was even more difficult. If Duque did not happen to have the wind and thunder divinity of the Wind Prince, he would not have been able to transform Thaddeus. Now, Duque did not have any extra divinity on hand. Then the so-called soul transformation was out of the question. However, complex transformation could not be done, but it did not mean that there was no way. Duque stretched out his hand, and with a special casting gesture, blue runes that emitted illusory light jumped out of his fingertips. Spirit Sealing Matrix. Strictly speaking, this did not belong to the category of mages. It should be said that it belonged to the domain of warlocks, demonic knowledge. Unlike Thaddeus, the pitiful Thaddeus was just an indifferent test subject. No one knew what would happen to him. Even if he became a Frankenstein-like existence, Kel Thuzad only threw him into the abomination zone to guard the door. The Death Knights were definitely a different matter. The Death Knights and Liches, as the backbone of the Scourge Legion, were definitely mature troops that had been tempered. From killing designated targets, to using soul punishment to force their souls to fall, to brainwashing willpower, it could be said that the entire process was impeccable. However, the Lich King's mind control imprint was actually not that good. At least in the original history, when the Lich King Zol left the Burning Legion, Sylvanas, who had become a death banshee, broke free from his control. In this life, it was the great Lich Anastrian who broke the shackles of mind control. Now, the new Lich King, Arthas, was still asleep. Kel Thuzad, the commander who directly controlled the four horsemen of the apocalypse, was temporarily sealed by Duque in the different dimension at the core of the fortress. This was an opportunity. Put the remains of the three of them into the Matrix. Let go of the dwarf's independence, and put Blamu and Zeliek together. The rest of the clerics, prepare to help me pour holy light into the Matrix. 3 paladins and 2 priests immediately stood nervously and orderly on the 5 corners of the pentagram matrix that Duque had condensed with magic. Who? Duque adjusted his breathing. He spread out his perception and spirit sense. External interference, eliminated. The soul connection between the Lich King and Kel Thuzad was cut off. Good. Get to work. Duque suddenly raised his head, his face slightly raised at a 30-degree angle. His righteous face was filled with a holy aura, and a golden radiance was faintly discernible on Duque's face. At some point, Duque's voice became ethereal. Even though Duque was right by her ear and his voice was endless, it sounded like a choir of children singing melodious hymns in a distant church. Perplexed soul. Can you see that on the other side of hell, there is still a lighthouse of holy light? Tormented souls. Can you hear your friends and relatives in the mortal world still calling your name? The darkness will eventually pass, just like the last darkness before dawn. Wake up. Come back. Listen. The call of your king. Duque waved his hand, and the kings immediately understood. Magni swung his hammer, and the materialized Balrog hammer smashed on the floor, making a crisp sound. Kurtaz, get back here. I don't want to tell your son that his dad ran off to become a lackey of the Scourge army when we're bragging in the tavern. Perhaps it was an illusion, but Lord Kurtaz's skull trembled. Sylvanas put her hands on her hips and said domineeringly, Blamu. Have you forgotten our oath? We swore to take revenge on the Scourge. We swore to chase Arthas to the end of hell, and now you've actually become a Death Knight. What do you look like? Get back here. Blamua's skeleton seemed to move. Kalia knelt down gently and made a praying gesture. Holy light bloomed on her pure face full of love. Sir Zeliek, you've done very well. But I sincerely believe that this shouldn't be the end of a warrior fighting against the scourge. Come back, I will pray for you. Following the call of the three kings, the souls of the three death knights seemed to respond. No. It's not enough. Benedictus, who had helped countless souls and had rich experience, gritted his teeth. The redemption of the soul is not that simple. The powerful will of the Lich King poured into their souls. Their willpower is not enough, so they need a stronger stimulus. A stronger stimulus? Where could a stronger stimulus come from? Theon clenched his fists, but he suddenly sighed secretly. Yes, not everyone's name was Uther. Not every soul had such a strong will to resist the soul torture and corrosion of Frostmourne. Leave it to me. Duque suddenly said. Every fallen soul often had not only the surrender of the will, but also the pollution of the heart. For example, even if Arthas became a death knight, Mal, Gannis and Kel, Thuzad at the time, they all faintly forced the fool to do things that he felt would make him more sinful, making him even more self-deprecating. Even if these three guys had not become death knights for a long time, as far as Duque knew, at least Kel, Thuzad had let them participate in the siege of Old Mograine and several massacres against civilians. Therefore, a simple call was not enough. Duque had the system elf, so it was naturally more possible. Using the soul techniques learned from the Burning Legion, Duque was able to read a considerable number of fragmented soul fragments from the souls of the three death knights. This was not something that was made up out of nothing. These were all things that had really happened to the three of them. It was just that Duque had picked them out and completed them. In an instant, illusory projection fragments appeared above the magic circle. It was a heroic fragment of Kurtaz rampaging around on the battlefield and killing his brothers in the tavern. It was a fragment of Blamu and Zeliek's tryst in the small grain field. Although this involved privacy, the souls of the three soon reacted. A series of metal cracking sounds came from the void, as if chains or something were disintegrating inch by inch. In the middle of the soul magic circle created by Duque, the Alliance powerhouses were pleasantly surprised to find that three silver souls rose from the remains of the three death knights like balloons. Soon, the souls had 4 limbs, a head, eyes, ears, a mouth, and a nose. Finally, even the patterns on the armor they wore were clearly visible. That's right, they were officially Blamu, Zeliek, and Kurtaz. The faces of the three of them were filled with shame. Kurtaz first knelt on one knee in front of Magni and said with his head lowered in remorse, "Sorry, it seems that I can't drink with your majesty in the future." Chapter 1274. On the other side, Blamua's soul was nestled in the arms of Zeliek's soul. The two of them seemed to be cowering a little. It was Zeliek who spoke first. "Sorry, Your Majesty Kalia, I screwed up." "It's not your fault." There were tears in the corners of Kalia's eyes. She used her slender fingers to gently wipe away the tears, and then revealed a smile that still looked like she was crying. "It's because we're too backward. If we could also master the technique of flying in the air earlier, then we wouldn't have to be beaten up like you guys. If anyone is at fault, it should be me, as the queen, who is the first to be at fault." Taking the initiative to take responsibility in this era of showing royal power and informing the people with an unbreakable hierarchy sounded more like a fantasy. For a moment, the couple was stunned. Queen Sylvie also came up. "Blamu, you did a good job. If you hadn't helped guard the Salis Trail for so long, perhaps the people of New Silvermoon would have starved. Also, I still owe you a wedding gift." Aurelia stepped forward. She didn't know if she could hug a soul. She looked at Duque and saw Duque smiling and nodding. Then, she hugged him directly. The feeling of being hugged by a living being, which was like a corporeal spiritual body, was incomparably mysterious and strange. After a moment of shock, tears of the soul fell from the corners of Blamua's eyes. The sighs and greetings lasted for a full 5 minutes. Then, all the existences turned their eyes to Duque. The question was this considered redemption? Duque cleared his throat. In fact, in this world, souls can stay in the mortal world forever. Perhaps in the form of a vengeful spirit, or a heroic spirit. Heroic spirit. This word made all the living people's hearts palpitate. The dead were already gone. Crossing the boundary between life and death was not accepted by the mainstream view. For example, the forgotten, then becoming a heroic spirit was the best choice. Heroic spirit. It is not unrestrained. Heroic spirits are similar to vengeful spirits. They also need a cornerstone-like attachment. In my opinion, the best choice for the three of you is to become the guardian spirit of this flying fortress that is about to be occupied by the Alliance, Naxxramas. Guardian spirit. The three souls became excited at the same time. It was as if their hearts, which had stopped beating a long time ago, were jumping with joy at this moment. With just a few words from Duque, the three souls suddenly found the meaning of continuing to exist in this world. As the former leaders of Naxxramas, of course they knew how powerful this flying fortress was. It was as if they could already see the gigantic fortress guarding the cursed land, resonating with the watchtower from top to bottom, forming a terrifying three-dimensional defense system. No matter how many terrifying demons poured out of the dark portal, they would only die in front of this terrifying defensive formation that resembled the Wall of Sighs. "We are willing," the three souls said in unison. Duque nodded and turned to everyone. "All right, let's get ready for the final battle. As long as we take care of Kel, Thuzad and Sapphiron, this great floating fortress will become the guardian of the Alliance and even the entire Azeroth." While Duque was cleaning up Naxxramas, fierce battles also broke out in various parts of Silithus. In the Temple of Karaj, the Scourge army that had been thrown down by Duque was making a final struggle. They guarded every corner of the temple ruins, and even the more powerful high-grade Death Knights tried to gather their companions and break out. In the Cenarian fortress in the north of Silithus, facing the insects that rushed out of the Pillar of Swarm, the Alliance directly used a terrifying barrage to deal with the overwhelming insects. Don't think about it, fire all the 3-style bombs. For this day, Lord Marcus has prepared at least 500,000 3-style bombs. Don't worry about the cannonballs. Worry about whether you have the life to fire all the cannonballs first. The Alliance's artillery commanders loudly scolded the artillerymen below. Duque had guided the Iron Furnace Fort to improve the technology for 20 years, and now the cannon produced by the Iron Furnace Fort rarely exploded. The production line, coupled with the strict limit on the number of times the cannon could be fired, almost eliminated the incidence of casualties caused by the artillery exploding. And the 3-style bombs 3, which could split into hundreds of small metal warheads in the air, were in a sense not the old-fashioned shotgun, but something close to a cluster bomb. The shotgun directly exploded in the cannon chamber, which was extremely damaging to the cannon barrel. The latest Type 3 style bombs used a 2-stage delayed ignition and detonation system. Only when the cannonball flew out of the cannon barrel for about 2 seconds would the second stage be ignited, detonating the small warheads in the cannonball and exploding. At first glance, it was even more dazzling than fireworks. The shotgun, whose purpose was to kill in an area, was, of course, useless against the thick-skinned big guys like the Heaven Breaker. But for the relatively slender, large-sized flying insects that did not have real hard armor, it was simply a nightmare. As long as a stray bullet or even a single piece grazed a limb, there would immediately be a hole slightly larger than the mouth of a bowl. Flesh and blood, limbs flying everywhere, all of these were not enough to describe the savagery of the Type 3 style bombs. That scene, it was as if after one shot, in a sphere with a diameter of 100 meters, not even a blade of grass would grow. All the flying insects would explode, turning into scattered limbs and parts that fell from the sky like rain. After a round of artillery fire, what fell from the sky was not just hundreds, but thousands of insects. In order to avoid accidental damage or even accidental killing by artillery fire, the coalition forces did not send out air forces. At a distance of 200 to 500 meters, it was within the range of the Cenarian Circle's Traians, as well as the coalition's temporary military magic tower and elven archers. Closer, there were dwarven gunners, humans, and troll spear throwers to deal with them. On land, the swarming insects could be said to be overwhelming. Unfortunately, in front of the continuous array of cannons, it was more like sending food. Ground attacks were not as complicated as air attacks. The dwarves and gnome cannoneers could pull out their large-caliber heavy cannons at will. For long-range attacks, there were new cannons. For closer attacks, there were new, small steel cannons, and dwarven mortars. Slightly closer, there were steam tanks and fire-breathing tanks blocking in front of them. This scene made Sal's eyelids twitch, and he could not help but think to himself, if the tribes were to fight, I really don't know how many tribal warriors would have to be sacrificed to win. The impact of this three-dimensional war concept made Sal's mouth full of bitterness. 21 years ago, his ancestors used muscle and barbaric weapons to conquer almost half of the Alliance. 21 years later, although he had worked hard to catch up and had stolen a large number of things from the goblins that were black technology for the orcs, he was shocked to find that the gap between the tribes and the Alliance had not only not narrowed, but had even widened. If there were no such things as magic, the Alliance could flatten the entire tribe with artillery alone. Orcs, trolls, and taurens could not even find a place to stay in front of the Alliance. Just as Sal's thoughts were a little scattered, an accident happened on the battlefield. Chapter 1275. It was a huge beetle-shaped bug. From afar, it looked like a small mountain. Just its bulging back was 5 stories high. This guy used its thick and solid carapace to block all the dwarves' artillery fire and rushed over. 3 dwarf Spitfire tanks bravely went up to meet it. Unfortunately, with a pinch of its huge mouth, one of the Spitfire tanks exploded on the spot, bursting into a small mushroom cloud of flames. The remaining 2 tanks were not spared either. The giant bug used its horns to dig and flip the 2 tanks upside down, and then there was a violent explosion. Krasis frowned deeply. In the absence of the Alliance's commanders, as well as the group of kings, he was the temporary commander of the Alliance Expeditionary Force. He could not bear to watch this scene. However, this kind of existence that exceeded conventional force had to be dealt with by someone strong. However, before he could speak, Sal had already taken a step forward and said in a clear voice, "The Alliance has done enough for this world. Leave this to the tribe's experts." There was no need for Sal to give another order. Rexer had already stepped out. Misha, Rexer, who had ogre blood and infinite strength, made an extremely shocking move. He threw out his pet war bear Misha, which weighed at least a ton. Yes, that's right, he threw it out. It was like a dwarf artillery soldier who had activated Deity Descends, and picked up a 1-ton mortar shell. However, Rexer was even more relaxed and satisfied. He had tossed away such a big bear just like that. Damn, it even had a spiraling effect. The experienced dwarf artillery soldier could not help but wonder if this Misha also had an armor-piercing or a second explosion function. It was obvious that the old dwarf was thinking too much. Rexer's Misha was very precious. He was not someone who shouted explosions are art all day long, nor was he a necromancer who lost his mind. How could he let his precious war pet do the work of self-destructing? But throwing out a 1-ton giant bear just like that, weight was indeed lethal. The big worm was dumbfounded by Misha's attack. With Rexer's command, Misha immediately entered a berserk state. Not only was his body suffused with a scarlet blood light, but his body also became a full size bigger. He actually managed to slap that incomparably large bug away with a single palm strike. Following that, Misha roared and pounced forward, his 2 large bare paws striking out continuously. With the shrill cries of the insects as the background music, almost every slap from Misha sent large pieces of the insect's carapace and flesh flying. Seeing this scene, Krasis could not help but nod and ask Sal, "Is this the legendary Beastmaster Hunter?" Not bad. Sal couldn't help but feel proud. The Beastmen had migrated to Kalimdor. Apart from not being able to catch up to the Alliance in terms of technology, they had also gained something. For example, in terms of the hunter profession, under the leadership of Lexer and the other hunters, they had developed talents such as Beastmaster Hunter. In terms of the research of professional skills, they had the potential to surpass the Alliance. Unfortunately, there were still too few professionals. The Alliance's artillery fire was still fierce, but no matter how strong the artillery fire was, it was impossible to shoot down all the invading insects. For a small number of insects that had rushed to the front of the formation, it was a bit of a waste to use the Alliance's battle formation to defend. For the Alliance soldiers, wearing full-body armor itself required physical strength. Looking at the endless stream of insects, Krasis discussed with Sal and decided that the tribal warriors would go out into the formation to kill the isolated insects, while the Alliance's elven archers and priests would provide support from the back. Occasionally, powerful insects would break in, and naturally, there would be Master Howl, Kane, and other strong warriors to deal with them. The battle lasted for more than 24 hours. Fortunately, the Alliance's military strength was strong, and they used a rotating system, so it was not impossible for them to hold on. At this time, there was a sudden rumble of cannons in the distance. They saw 3 huge flying battleships, sweeping away the clouds and slowly descending from a high altitude where the flying insects could not reach. As they descended, they opened all the cannons exaggeratedly, using the height and parabola to clear the insect colony further away that the heavy cannons of the stronghold could not hit. Almost every cannonball that fell would set off a column of smoke more than 10 meters high. Sand and insect limbs flew everywhere, and the scene was spectacular. The great and invincible figure, the dense and terrible cannons on the side of the ship, and the Alliance flag fluttering in the wind, all stimulated the eyes of the tribal warriors. Whether it was the Alliance or the tribe, all the warriors let out a deafening cheer. Sal's face was a little blue. Fortunately, his face was green, so the Alliance did not look obvious, but Wajin immediately noticed it. Without Sal's command, Wajin turned his hand and grabbed the collar of the goblin boss who joined the tribe, the Prince of Trade, Garavix, the owner of the Rustwater conglomerate. The wise Wajin spoke in the goblin language that very few people could understand. Do you see that thing in the sky? If we don't want our main city to be threatened by that thing's cannons in the future, the tribe must also have its own flying battleship. It was easier said than done to build a flying battleship of the level of the Heavenbreaker. Looking at the extremely exaggerated design of the 8 propellers, Garavix could feel the technical barriers contained in it. He thought of the sad days when he was threatened by the Alliance with cannons, and was threatened by King Delin that if he did not pay taxes, he would not be able to do business. The goblin boss fiercely clenched his teeth. The tribe will have a flying battleship. How long? 3 years. If we can steal the blueprint, it will be a year at most. Duque did not know the dirty thoughts of the several leaders of the tribe. At this moment, in Naxxramas, Duque was chatting with the people around him while dividing the spoils. Well, as long as there are no accidents, Naxxramas will belong to our alliance. As long as we get on Karaj, we can form a joint flying fleet of the Alliance and the tribe. Joint flying fleet? Where did the tribe get a flying ship? Elugio was curious. Technical output, of course, Duque replied casually. Magni was annoyed. Hey! Duque, although you came up with the idea, the research and practice are all done by us dwarves and gnomes. If you say technical output, then so be it. You should also consider our feelings. Duque chuckled. What are you so nervous about, old man? When have I ever let the dwarves, gnomes, and even the Alliance suffer losses? I didn't ask you to give the latest, Heavenbreaker, blueprint to the tribe. Can't you give the tribe some early-stage flying ship blueprints with single-cylinder and twin propellers? If you don't give the new cannons, you can at least give the outdated stuff without rifling. Think about it, if you sell all those dust-eating things in your warehouse, that would be money and ores. Speaking of this, Magni's eyes instantly lit up. When it comes to doing business, you humans are still the most cunning. But I like it. The two bad guys high-fived each other and then laughed evilly. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.